Hi, welcome back, guys. This is your friend, the Momo Fanfics, back with the amazing fanfiction. This is series of What If Deku Become a Ghost Rider? Sleep was the last thing on Izuku's mind as he sat in his chair watching the computer with a wide smile. Izuku Midoriya was born into a world where superheroes, once a thing of fiction, were a very real occupation. Izuku always had a fascination with heroes, even desiring to be one. When he turns 5, his parents plan to take him to the quirk doctor, and that's only a few days away. Izuku was watching his favorite video of all time. The video was one he'd seen thousands of times up to this point. It was old disaster footage from roughly 10-20 years ago. The footage was the debut of Izuku's and the world's greatest hero, All Might. Izuku watched as All Might saved the people while making his debut, his smile infectious. If Izuku knew, he wouldn't wake his parents, he'd be jumping with joy and laughing. But for now, he settled for vibrating with excitement. All Might's the greatest, Izuku yelled, while pumping his hands. And when I get my quirk, I'll be just like All Might. Izuku's mind filled with him battling villains and saving innocent people with a laugh and a big grin on his face. It's him. The greatest hero ever, Might Jr. Izuku bounded over a building with his cape flowing behind him. He lands in the street with a loud crash and points towards a robot holding a young girl hostage. You, dirty villain, let the girl go or face the wrath of my smashes, Izuku announced valiantly. The robot began sweating bolts and shaking. Might Jr. I'll let her go. Jay, just don't beat me up. The robot lets the girl go, and she runs past Izuku. Izuku claps his hands forward and causes a shockwave to slam into the robot, sending him flying over the rooftops. I'll get you, Might Jr. Izuku laughs heroically as people begin cheering his name, and All Might appears clapping for him as well. Izuku held his All Might figure in the air with a bright smile. I knew you could do it, Might Jr., he whispered as he imitated All Might. He continued watching the video on repeat, even as the time passed 3 a.m. Izuku knew that in the next few days, he'd be capable of being the greatest hero in the world. Nothing could stop him. Sorry, kid, it's just not happening, the quirk doctor states rather bluntly. Izuku froze up with a strained smile. Wait, so you believe something's wrong with Izuku? Hisashi Midoriya asks. Hisashi was a little older than the woman next to him. He had short raven black hair with slight graying at his temple from the stress of his job. His eyes seemed to resemble a dim inferno, being a soft hue of orange. The most eye-catching feature, however, was the wisps of smoke that would escape his mouth from time to time. Well, his kindergarten classmates have already begun to show signs. Inko Midoriya adds, Inko was Hisashi's partner and mom supreme. She had darker green hair than Izuku, and had it tied up, though only a little of it at the top. The doctor turned and grabbed a tablet, before scrolling through it for a moment. My records say you two are 4th-generation quirk users. The doc says, what powers do you two have? I don't have anything particularly special, just attracting small objects to my hands. Inko says, looking at Izuku worried. I can breathe fire, but I wasn't into the hero business when I was younger, Hisashi says. The doctor nods. Izuku should have already manifested one of your quirks or a combination of both. But after viewing his X-rays, I don't think he's going to. He turns his head towards an X-ray on a whiteboard. You see, when superpowers first began appearing, there were many research studies conducted and doctors discovered a link between the bones in a person's foot and their likelihood of developing a quirk. The parents glance at each other with worried looks. People with powers have only one joint in their pinky toes. Their bodies have evolved into a more streamlined version of the human form. The doctor stands up and points to the X-rays. You can see here that Izuku has 2 joints in his pinky, like roughly 20% of the population these days. The parents both looked at Izuku, who hasn't moved since the doctor began his explanation. Based on the research that's available, it's safe to say your son isn't going to develop a quirk. The doctor finishes. The news devastated the family. Izuku was less like his usual self, and his parents became a bit overbearing. They even planned on homeschooling him, but Izuku begged them to let him stay at school because he felt he needed to keep going even without a quirk. All Might slowly had less impact on him. He still enjoyed the posters and some of the action figures, but it was a little painful to look at them now. Izuku had become a little bitter towards heroes. He still mostly enjoyed them, but after the first year of elementary and the overbearing parents, he grew to be bitter towards them. Another thing that happened was a surprise for him. He was going to be an older brother. Inko was pregnant, and soon she would give birth. Hisashi was ecstatic, and Izuku felt true joy for the first time in almost 2 years. Hisashi and Izuku sat in the hospital waiting room. Izuku was nervously fiddling with a pencil he used for his notebooks and drawing. Hisashi was fiddling with a pen he used to sign papers and checks. The two were quiet, almost desperately so, as if a single peep would spell doom for the world. Thoughts raced through both Midoriya's minds, several nervous little thoughts, and one made Izuku speak up. "What if they don't like me?" he asks in a quiet tone. Hisashi turns his head towards Izuku. "Who?" "My siblings." Hisashi turns fully towards the now 10-year-old Izuku. "Why wouldn't they like you?" Izuku turns away, still fiddling with the pencil. "Because I'm quirkless." Hisashi's eyes widened in surprise. He didn't think his son would think about these things, but Izuku had always been more aware of the world than others his age. "Izuku, look at me." Izuku turns to his father. "That doesn't matter to them. They will love you as much as we do." Izuku looks at the floor. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I love you. And if anything, they'll love you even more." Izuku looks at Hisashi again. "Your siblings are the combination of me and your mother's love, in more ways than one. They are a combination of all of our love, and that means our love for you," Hisashi says, making Izuku's eyes widen. Izuku looks right at Hisashi, who's giving Izuku a smile, and Izuku smiles too. "Hisashi Midoriya?" Izuku and Hisashi look towards the voice and see a doctor. "She's ready to see you." Hisashi stands and looks at Izuku. He looks at Hisashi and nods. Hisashi smiles brighter, takes Izuku's hand, and follows the doctor. Izuka, Izumi, and Izuki. 3 little girls were born that day, all Midoriyas. Izumi was born first, and she was obviously going to be a troublemaker. She had the same green hair as Inko, but completely black stripes toward the end of the puff of hair on her head. The most striking feature, though, was her eyes, an emerald green from Inko and a soft orange from Hisashi. Izuka was born second, and she looked a lot like her father. She had a pair of orange eyes, though they seemed brighter than Hisahi's, and a tuft of pure black hair rested on her head. Izuki was the last triplet born, and she took her mother's features. Her pair of emerald eyes had a drive to them, and from what Inko had told Izuku, it was the same when he was born. Before the triplets were born, Hisashi had looked into a new apartment for the family. The apartment they were in had been made with only 2 people in mind, so they needed more space. Thankfully, Hisashi had gotten a pretty good deal for a larger apartment a few blocks from their old one. The new apartment was on the 6th floor of the 8-story building it was in, and was built with a family of 6 in mind. Izuku loved the new apartment. He also really liked the 2 bathrooms that would be needed. Inko also loved it, but for a different reason. Hisashi didn't have a place he could work at the old apartment, and so had to set up his work in their room. Inko had stayed awake listening to Hisashi typing or writing something multiple times because of it. Now, though, Hisashi had a whole room he could use for his work, and that should be the end of Inko's restless nights and irritable mornings. Izuku was happy, as he could be. Middle school had proven to be a bit more of a challenge, with asshat kids trying to pick on him because he was quirkless. He mostly stayed alone, though would talk to the occasional person. Izuku was a target for the more popular children with powerful quirks, but was able to avoid getting in their sights, until an event when he was 12 and in his first year of middle school. Hisashi marched down the hall and straight to the principal's office. He had gotten a call about a fight and Izuku was involved. Inko would have come, but she was busy with the triplets, so he came alone. From what he knew, Izuku got dragged into a schoolyard brawl instigated by an upperclassman. Hisashi walked up to the principal's door and knocked. "Come in," a voice exclaimed. Hisashi walked in and was greeted by the principal behind his desk and Izuku sitting in a chair opposite to him. Hisashi took a seat next to Izuku and glanced at him. Izuku had a few bandages covering his cheek, a large bruise on his chin, and a bandage covering what he assumed was a busted lip. Hisashi frowned at the injuries and looked at the principal. "What happened?" he asked in a straightforward tone. "Your son participated in a fight on school grounds. He is responsible for several injuries to other students, and even broke the nose of one of our top candidates for UA," he said in an even voice. Hisoshi's eyes widened at the news of what his son did. He looked at Izuku and then back to the principal. "I was informed that someone instigated it," he asked. The principal nodded. "Yes, which is why your son is only getting a few months' worth of detention. The kid who started it used their quirk on school grounds. The child's quirk basically makes anyone in a few meter radius highly aggressive. What'll happen to the kid who caused this? He'll be expelled, possibly sent to a reformatory institution." Hisashi nodded at the answer. "Truthfully, I didn't want to punish anyone affected by the quirk, but considering the injuries and the phone calls I've already gotten, I've no choice." Hisashi nodded. He understood what complaints can do to public establishments. "Is there anything else I should know?" Hisashi questioned. Izuku stayed quiet as the principal and his dad continued speaking. He was thinking about the fight. Izuku was replaying several things over in his head, getting socked across the jaw, punching that rabbit girl in the nose and her smirking back at him. He just couldn't get it out of his head. Eventually the meeting ended and Izuku and Hisashi left the office. Walking down the halls, Izuku spotted the same girl he punched earlier. Tan skin, rabbit ears, and white hair. Her uniform was a little roughed up, and she was wearing the dress shirt instead of the normal shirt of the female uniform. She spotted him too, crimson locking with emerald. They looked at each other as they continued walking. Eventually she smiled, and if Izuku was getting the right impression, it was a playful one. But her eyes held a predatory look as if examining something in him. Not one to back down, he smiled back, and even waved. Her smile grew as they finally lost sight of each other. Izuku sat at his desk, looking over several options for high school. Izuku had gotten fairly good options. All of them had good curriculums, and would give him a good shot in life. But he was looking for a specific class that was taught. Izuku sifted through the pile and found something that he was kinda surprised to see. A general studies letter. Izuku held the pamphlet in his hands, just staring at it, and not noticing the little green-haired girl sneak in. "What's that?" Izuku asked. Izuku jumped in his seat, not expecting for one of his 4-year-old sisters to sneak in. "Kami, Izuki, don't do that," Izuku yelled. Izuki, being the shy girl she is, cowered down at being scolded. Izuku stopped looking at her and asked, "So, is there something you need?" Izuki hopped back up. "Can you show me that video again?" she asked energetically, the scolding completely forgotten. "What video?" "The about All Guy? Might Guy? Oh, All Might." She hopped up and down at finally remembering. Izuku looked at her with an eyebrow raised. He didn't expect her to like it so much. A while ago Izuku was alone with the triplets. He showed them the video of All Might's debut. Izumi had chanted for All Might to save those people and Izuka was right next to her doing the same. Izuki wasn't doing either of those, she was just sitting there, eyes glued to the screen. Thinking about it, Izuku shouldn't be too surprised. Then again he expected the other two to come and ask. Izu, speak of the devil." Standing in the doorway were Izumi and Izuka. "Could you show us as well?" Izuku smiled and got up, walking to his computer and bringing up YouTube. The triplets piled onto his chair and watched the video as Izuku went back to his desk. He picked up the a pamphlet, and looked through it, and found the class he was looking for. "You want to go to UA?" Inko asked as she looked at the pamphlet. "I thought you accepted you couldn't be a hero, Izuku," Hasashi said. He was looking at it too. Izuku had gone to his parents about this, and they immediately got the wrong idea. Though this rejection of a dream he still had small hopes for was frustrating, he pushed those feelings down and focused on fixing the misunderstanding. "It's not for the hero course," Izuku says. Inko and Hisashi look up at him. "I'm not planning on being a hero. It's the class on the top left, front page." Inko and Hisashi look at the directed spot and see engineer's class. "Oh," both say. Hisashi looks at Izuku. "Well, at least you know your limits." Izuku nods, but is still frustrated by his parents putting down his dream. "Besides, I don't think my heart could handle you in the hero course," Inko says, and adding more frustration to Izuku's ever-growing pile. "Yeah," Izuku grits out. Izumi yells as she busts Izuku's door open. Izumi runs into the room and hops around. "Come on, it's time for the quirk doctor. Oh, I can't wait." "I can." Izuku groans out tiredly. Izumi gasps at her teenage brother and jumps on his bed in an attempt to get him up. "But come on, don't you want to see what we get?" Izuku wanted nothing more than for her to be quiet and let him sleep. And then he remembered his doctor visit. Izuku pushed Izumi off the bed and got up. Izumi just laid upside down against the bed. "All right," Izuku said. "Yay!" Izumi put her hands up in victory. Or sideways, technically. Izuku sits in the waiting room, tapping the balls of his feet on the ground. He's been waiting for about 10 minutes, and finally the door to the doctor's office opens. The triplets run out of the doors happily. "Guess I wasn't needed," Izuku murmured as they approached him. "Izu, we got our quirks," they announced happily. Izuku couldn't help but smile at his siblings. Izumi had a perfect combination of her parents. She can breathe fire and manipulate it around her. Izuka had Hisashi's quirk, but far more powerful, though it seems it mutated to where she can literally eat other fires. Izuki got a variation of Inko's quirk. She can pull and push objects up to several tons in weight. Izuku listened to his sisters explain their quirks, while he wrote them down in a notebook he used to keep track of quirks. Originally, the notebooks used to be called Hero Analysis for the Future. Now he just calls them quirk books. "Thanks, you three," he said, finishing up the analysis. "You're welcome. But now that we have our quirks, we can protect you," Izuki declared, getting Yaz from the other two triplets. Izuku stopped moving. He thought about what they just said. He understood they cared for him, but they were still adding to the frustration pile. They also just got their quirks, and slowly he got mad. He wouldn't snap at his sisters, but he needed to leave. Izuku acted like he just got a message on his phone and pulled it out. "Hey Mom, Dad, I gotta go. A friend just texted me," Izuku said. "Oh, do you need me to drop you off?" Hisashi offered. But Izuku shook his head. "No, they're close by." Izuku left without getting an answer. Hisashi and Inko looked at each other in confusion. Izuku walked a few blocks away before ducking into an alley. He stood there and just breathed deeply before kicking a pallet. "Arg," he yelled. Asterisk kick asterisk. "I'm not helpless. Asterisk kick asterisk. I can take care of myself. Asterisk kick asterisk. Asterisk crash asterisk." Izuku stood there panting. He just smashed a pallet and caused it to fall onto something that sounded like shattering glass. He backed up to a wall and slid down it. He reached into his pocket and pulled his phone out and dialed up a contact. He waited for the line to connect. "Hey. I'm manageable. You? That's good. Right to the point, huh?" Izuku chuckles. "I'm just frustrated. Needed someone to talk to." "No, I'd rather just hang out in an arcade. Maybe go to an underground fight club." Oh, Kami, don't remind me. Izuku laughs. So, you want to come to me or? All right, I'm coming. I should be there in a few minutes. All right, see you soon. Izuku hangs up and puts his head against the wall. He reaches into his jacket and pulls a pack of gum out and slips it into his mouth. He gets up and leaves the alley to meet with his friend. Izuku is sitting in his engineering class, waiting for his teacher to arrive. Izuku was fairly surprised to find he was the only kid to apply for this class. His teacher is a nice guy, a little scruffy, but then again so is he. Izuku was wearing UA's engineer coveralls. They were gray and had UA's insignia on his back. He was flipping a wrench when the door opened behind him. "Hey, sensei," he said. "I don't believe I teach you." A voice definitely not his sensei said. He turned around only for his mouth to hang open and drop the wrench. Power loader, sir." Izuku stands straighter, and power loader laughs. "Don't worry, kid. I'm not fond of the sir crap." "Sorry." Izuku looked away. Izuku couldn't believe it. Power loader was talking to him. Power loader was the teacher for the support course, well-known support item creator and hero. So, what are you doing here?" "Well, I was just walking by when I saw the lights were on." Power loader explains. "I looked at the time, said what the heck, and decided to see what was going on." "Oh, that makes sense." Power loader looks around. "Where's your sensei?" he asks. "Oh, he should be." Izuku was cut off by an explosion from the garage door. "There." He finishes. The doors fly open and smoke billows out as Izuku goes for the fire extinguisher. A figure moves through the smoke. "I'm here." A man steps out of the smoke. The man is wearing the overalls, though they seem very worn. He's sporting a pair of goggles on his eyes and his stylish pink dreadlocks. He's also got noticeable stubble. "Sorry about the mess." Izuku rushes past the man. "I got it, sensei," he exclaims as he goes through the smoke. "Thanks, Midoriya," the sensei says as he pats himself down. He finally takes notice of Power Loader. "Hello, how's it going?" "Ren Hatsume," Power Loader says sternly. "The one and only well used to be. There is a Mrs. and a little one at home now." "Oh, Kami, you multiplied." He, and you're gonna have to deal with May when she grows up." "Oh, kill me now." "Sorry, pal. You've got at least 30 more years in you." Power Loader groans in suffering as Hatsume snickers. "Sensei." Ren turns towards the emerging Izuku. Fires out. Good, good." He turns back to Power Loader. "Well, it's been fun, but I got a kid to teach." Ren walks over to Izuku, leaving Power Loader to walk out of the class. Power Loader only made it to the stairwell when another explosion followed by the sound of Ren's laughter sent a chill up his spine. "Please, Kami, don't let his daughter get in Yua," he prayed. Izuku is lying in bed, and he's mad. A few days ago, Power Loader came to him with a proposition. Izuku had been one of the top engineers at U for his first year, and since starting his second year a few weeks ago, Power Loader offered to have Izuku transferred to the support course. He had been ecstatic and couldn't wait to tell his parents, but when he got home and told them, they said no. They had explained that recently a few support company engineers had been kidnapped. They didn't want that to happen to him, so Izuku was denied his final chance at being close to the hero business. He nearly blew up at his parents just barely getting out of the house, which he spent at the dump destroying the already broken crap there. He had to tell Power Loader he couldn't, and he could hear the disappointment in his voice. Thankfully, it was Friday, so Izuku could be mad in peace, and then his phone rang. Luckily, it was a tone he recognized. Grabbing the phone off his desk and sliding the answer cursor, he held it up to his ear. "How's it going?" Izuku sighs. "You know me way too well." "I'm fine. No, screw it, I'm terrible." "No, I don't want to talk about it. So how was your day?" "Huh. I supposed we both had a pretty shitty day." "Maybe. You know what, fuck it, I'm down." "So your place." Wait, what about your parents? For a week? Damn, that's lucky. All right, I should be there soon. Yep, you too. Izuku cuts the call and goes to his closet. Izuku had grabbed his only All Might Bronze Age hoodie that he got a few months back. He moved through the apartment and checked the time. 2:17 am. Izuku nodded and moved towards the balcony and hopped over the railing. He grabbed a pipe attached to the building and clambered down, eventually making it to the ground, and ran off into the night. Inko sat at the dining table staring at the document in front of her. She had a blank face as she was so engrossed in thought everything else was tuned out. So she didn't notice Hisashi walking in the room. Hey, honey, have you seen? Hisashi cut himself off at seeing Inko's blank face. Honey, no response. Hisashi walked over to her and placed a hand on her shoulder and caused Inko to nearly shoot out of her seat. Hisashi, don't do that, darn it, Inko squealed out. I've been trying to get your attention, he defended. Oh. Inko now felt a bit embarrassed. Sorry, what were you asking? That can wait. What's got you so entranced? He looks at the paper she was staring at, and Inko follows his gaze. It's a college offer for Izuku. Hisashi looks at her and smiles. Really? Wow. So who wants him? Inko looks at him with hesitation. America. Hisashi freezes. Did he hear that right? America? He parrots. Inko nods. From what I've read. Inko explains. It's based in Nevada, a place called Iris City. Apparently, they've been looking overseas for talented engineers, and you had recommended our son. Inko was obviously very proud, but apprehensive as well. But Izuku graduated almost a year ago. I know. But the letter explained it took so long because of the recommendation process. Inko says, it took them months just to come to a decision. Inko and Hisashi stare at the letter, silently contemplating something. Honey, you know he can't see this, right? Hisashi says. I know. We should just toss it. He grabs the paper and walks to the trash can, crumbles it, and tosses it in. Hisashi stood there thinking about what he just did. Izuku would never get a chance like this again, and they got rid of his future. Eventually, he decided it was for the best. Izuku would have been eaten alive in America, and he and Inko couldn't let that happen. Later that night, Izuku had just got home from his job at Hatsume Repair Depot. He had walked in with an empty can of pepper duck and went to throw it away. He tossed it in on his way by, but heard the can hit something that sounded like paper. Izuku groaned as he believed his sisters got into his work request again, so he went to investigate. Izuku looked in the bin, and sure enough a wad of paper greeted him. Izuku grabbed the paper, unwadded it, and noticed something very different than he was expecting. Izuku stared at the college letter, reading it from the top down. Izuku's lips tugged until he smiled and tears began welling up in his eyes, and he was about to jump in joy when a realization struck him. The letter was thrown away. Izuku stared dumbly at the counter, his mind racing to understand why it was there. His brain raced for an answer until it got one and all thoughts grinded to a stop. Izuku realized exactly why it was there. His mom and dad threw it away, or at least one of them. Izuku felt something he'd tried to bury as much as possible, and it was bubbling to the surface, rage. Izuku's face contorted into a snarl. He stood straighter and marched to his parents' room. Izuku grabbed the doorknob and violently opened the door, startling his parents. Oh, Izuku wide yo. Hisashi was cut off by Izuku holding up a paper he and Inko recognized. Both of them felt their hearts drop. What was this doing in the trash? Izuku ground out through grit teeth. Inko and Hisashi didn't know what to say and kept opening their mouths and shutting them, like a fish gasping for air. Well? Izuku yelled impatiently. Both parents flinched at Izuku's tone. Look, Hisashi started. The college will take you to America and well. How are we supposed to protect you there? Izuku stared at him, his face going from anger to one with no emotion. Izuku stood there just staring at them, and then he started laughing. "Protect me," he said between laughs, while moving towards the door. "That's always your answer." Izuku walks out the door. Inko and Hisashi look at each other in worry. Asterisk crash asterisk. Both Hisashi and Inko jumped, and the triplets who were in their rooms jumped at the noise as well. Inko and Hisashi rush out their door and stop, staring at the now broken family photo hung up in the hall. The triplets rush in and gasp at the destroyed memory. It was a picture of the family when Izuku was 14 and the triplets 4. Inko bends down and gingerly grabs the photo. Hisashi looks down the hall and sees Izuku move into his room. The triplets see this too and move to follow, leaving Hisashi to comfort Inko, who started crying. The triplets enter Izuku's room to see him stuffing his laptop into a backpack. "What are you doing?" Izuku demands. "Packing," Izuku says while grabbing a shirt. "Why?" Izumi questions. "Because I'm leaving." That caught the triplets off guard. "Where and why? You do know mom's crying, right?" Izumi says, confused and frustrated at Izuku's dismissal. Izuku looks at them dead in the eye. "Why should I care?" The triplets' hearts stop. They didn't hear that right? Seems like she does that a lot. The confusion leads to anger and Izumi snaps at Izuku. "What is wrong with you?" Izuku turns to her. "Why do you not care? She loves you and we love you. Why would you say that?" Izumi is panting, her face red with anger. Izuku stays quiet, still putting things in his bag. Izumi gets more frustrated and is about to go on a tirade when Izuku stands abruptly and moves his way towards the door. He shoves past his sisters, but stops near Izumi. He turns to her while taking out the paper for the U.S. college. "They threw this away and tried to keep me here," he explained. "They have done this twice to great opportunities for me. I won't let it happen a third. But they just want to protect you. Dang it," Izumi shouts at Izuku. He frowns at her and scoffs, turning towards the door. Izuka gets in front of Izuku and spreads her arms trying to stop him. "No, you're not leaving. You're going to apologize to Mom and Da." She gets cut off by Izuku shoving her aside and continuing forward. Izuki stands there unsure of what to do and tries to go to Izuku. But he's already opened the door and is halfway out it. "Izuku Midoriya." The triplets jolt, and Izuku stops, turns and sees the red-faced Inko. "You are not to leave this house. I am your mother, and I am telling you to apologize to Yo." Inko is cut off by something that makes everyone freeze. "Fuck you," Izuku says. His family stares at him, and he slams the door shut. They all stay frozen. Izuku just cussed at Inko. Inko visibly shakes, slowly slumping to the floor and finally breaks down in tears. Hisashi, who was stupefied by Izuku, moves towards his wife and tries to comfort her. The triplets just stood there wondering what had just happened. Was Izuku always like this, or was it something else? They didn't know. Izuki stared at the door, as if in a trance. Izumi regained a fraction of her glare, but it was pathetic. Izuka just went to Inko and tried to comfort her as well. Izuku didn't come back that night. The family looked for Izuku everywhere. They never found him. Time passed and eventually, they had to accept he wasn't coming back. The triplets didn't change much. Izumi was still focused on being a hero, though she put more time into it. Izuka was the same quiet girl who reigned in Izumi when she went too egotistical, though she somehow got into more trouble than before. Izuki seemed more determined to become a hero. She was still holding on to the dream of becoming Izuku's hero. She would train with her quirk where possible. Inko eventually became a functioning human again and decided to try to go out more. Hisashi was all for it. He'd taken Izuku leaving hard, but still kept his family together, even rejecting a job offer overseas that would have paid far better because of the state of his family. A few months after Izuku left, they started getting gift baskets filled with sweets. They read the tags on them and found they came from someone with the alias Dumb Bunny. 5 years had eventually passed. The 6th anniversary of Izuku leaving getting closer as the year dragged on. The triplets were finally old enough to attempt the UA entrance exam. Ugh, I'm so nervous, Izuki said. Izuki and her sisters were walking through the gate toward UA. The large building in the shape of an H imposed on all who entered. Izuki shifted under the imposing building, as if it were judging her. Oh, we're gonna ace this shit, Izumi yelled out, seemingly unaffected by the imposing building. Izuki sighed and wished she had a quarter of her sister's courage. Just not the sewer mouth that came with it. Izumi, please calm down. Izuka, the mediator, back at it again. But come on, we're finally here. Izumi gestured towards the building. You motherfucking A. Izuka smacked Izumi across the head with a newspaper that came out of nowhere. Watch the language. What would Mom say? Well, she ain't here at the moment, so who gives a shit? That earned her another smack by the newspaper. Izuki couldn't help but giggle at her sister's antics. That boy, Bakugo, is not helping with your mouth, Izuka stated. Izuki had to agree there. She didn't know Bakugo, as well as her sisters did, but even she'd heard of his fiery mouth back at Aldera. Hey, don't go bad-mouthing, cat. Well, it's true. That boy needs to learn to keep his lips shut and to respect people, Izuka sighed. I don't understand what you see in the boy. He makes me happy, she said, smiling. More like his tongue does, Izuka retorted. That too, she admitted shamelessly. Izuki gagged at the image that invaded her mind. There's also his temper. It seemed to rub off on you. That's not true. I've always had a temper. Then there's the swearing. Hey, you shut your whore mouth. Point exactly. Well, at least he's not as bad with it as his mother. The sisters stopped arguing at that and thought of Mitsuki Bakugo. Yeah, you're right, Izuka admitted. Not even a competition, Izuki added. Izumi nodded her head and looked back at the entrance to UA. It had finally sunk in as to what they were doing. What do you think Izuku would have said? Izumi asked in a tone that simply didn't match her personality. The sisters were quiet for a while until Izuki spoke up. I like to believe he'd have been proud, she said with confidence. Izuku had become a taboo subject to talk about. They didn't hate him by any means. Just talking about him usually brought the entire family's mood down. Well then, let's do this, Izumi says with brimming confidence. For Izuku. For Izuku, Izuki and Izuka exclaim. The three continued into U and went through the entrance exam. Izuka and Izumi aced the practical, while Izuki limped into the top 20. Izuki's quirk seemed to amplify in power during the exam and single-handedly destroyed the 0-pointer. She also busted her arm and was fussed over by Inko. The triplets had to wait for their letters from UA. It was an agonizingly slow wait. Most days they'd train and work on their fitness. Others they'd play video games, read, write hero fanfiction, or something else. A few weeks after the entrance exam, the triplets were laying on the couch watching some old movies. They never really understood why they liked them, but something about a quirkless man doing something awesome just made them beam. The three were about to put in another film when a knock had come from the door. Their mother answered and nearly squealed when she saw the envelopes. She composed herself until the messenger left, and then she bolted for the triplets. Each of them took the envelope with their name on it. They flipped them over, and each of them widened their eyes in a synchronization only triplets could do. Yua. The triplets leaped and bounded to private areas of the house to open their envelope. Each triplet opened their envelopes and was greeted by a small puck-like object. At first they were confused until the puck sputtered and a hologram appeared. Izuka was greeted by the principal, Nezu. Izumi was greeted by the pro-hero Snipe. And Izuki was greeted by the world's symbol of peace, All Might. The three UA faculty members say the same thing with their own flares and encouragement, though Izuki's was a little longer with All Might speaking about their training. The triplets were on their way to being heroes. Later that day, the family went out to an all-American diner that opened up a few months before. Izuki was mesmerized by the look of the diner. She briefly wondered if Izuku had been going to these places in America before her family called her over to the booth Izumi and Inko had picked out. They ordered several things that would make a normal American salivate: milkshakes, fries, burgers, and chicken strips with a side of gravy. Inko commented on the number of unhealthy items on the menu as she ate a salad. The others didn't really listen to her as they chowed down on several unhealthy foods. Eventually, they decided it was best to go home. They all walked out as snow slowly began to fall. Izumi was excited while Hisashi and Inko were pleading internally for the snow to stop, so they didn't have to deal with it when they went to work the next morning. They never noticed the man standing across the street, watching them with a warm smile as they left. The night air was chilled and bitter as snow fell. Sirens blared through an area of deserted highway. A robbery had occurred only 2 hours before. The heroes had scrambled after the armored transport that had smashed into the front of a bank and hauled away millions in yen. Rocklock is in the lead car. How the hell did these guys even get an armored transport like that? He questioned. How am I supposed to know? I didn't give it to him. The passenger hero responds. He leans out of the car and fires at the tires with his arm cannon. The bullets just bounce off the wheels. Damn, I can't penetrate the armor. Rocklock stays focused on the road, but can already tell this was going to be difficult. He sees one of the other pursuers pass him and gain on the transport. One of the heroes in the car opens the sunroof and sits on the roof. They raise their arms and a blue energy starts surrounding them. But before they can do anything, one of the villains leans out the transport window and fires a green beam from their finger. They had aimed for the hero's head, and upon contact, his head exploded. The hero's body falls out of the car and onto the road. Rocklock swerves out of the way, but the driver behind him isn't so lucky. The corpse bounces directly into the other driver's windshield and causes them to swerve before running off the highway and to their deaths. Rocklock grits his teeth in anger. Those bastards aren't getting away with this, he declared. Damn it. We need backup, Rocklock. The hero in the passenger seat says. I know that, but nobody's near us, so we have to make do. The passenger seat hero grumbles in frustration, but nods his head in reluctant agreement. The villains were having a right laugh about that hero they just killed. Ha ha, did you see that? The woman who killed the hero laughed sadistically. Yeah, real fucking funny. Thanks for causing us more issues just to get your fix, the driver says sarcastically. He was probably the only level-headed villain in the truck. Oh, come on. It was hilarious, seeing the guy go into the other windshield. His brain matter. She trailed off into a mutter of all the greatness of the gore. The driver glanced at her with visible disgust on his face. He had gotten roped into this heist after the gang he was driving for saw his driving skill, and he really wished he hadn't asked for their most powerful member to accompany them. God, he wished he never even said he'd consider it. The woman next to him was truly the definition of a sexual freak. From what he knew, she took actual pleasure in the sight of gore. This fact was solidified in his mind from the image next to him and the damp smell coming from her seat. The freak glances at the rear view and is greeted by an odd sight, an ethereal orange glow from behind the hero's cars. Well, Tilda, look out boys, they have backup. When she said this, the villains in the back of the transport look out the small window slits and see what she was talking about. Got him, Nit? Hey, drive faster. We gotta lose them. One of them shouted towards the driver. Ooh, did we call for backup? The hero next to Rocklock asks. Rocklock glances at the hero before looking into his rearview mirror, and to his surprise, a bright light was shown in the distance and growing brighter every second. The light finally got close enough to see in Rocklock, and he assumed the other hero gaped at the sight. A muscle car, he assumed was American, was engulfed in fire. The metal was charred black, and a low red glow that looked to be veins flowed through the car. It rocketed past the shocked heroes at speeds no muscle car should achieve. "Come on, go faster. The car's getting closer," one of the villains yelled at the driver. Another one grabbed a case near the duffel bags filled with cash. He popped the lid open and took out an object that brought a smile to his face. "Don't worry, I'll handle it," the villain said. Rocklock watched the fire car get closer to the transport and also watched as the back doors were kicked open and a villain wielding a Gotham rocket launcher aimed at the car. The villain smiled savagely and fired. The rocket directly contacted the ground in front of the muscle car, sending it up into the air. The road beneath where it once crumbled to the ground beneath. Rocklock's eyes widened as he slammed on the brakes, the other cars behind him doing the same. The villains laughed at the sight and momentarily forgot about the flaming muscle car. That was a mistake. The muscle car spun in the air, still moving forward, but as it came back down it seemed to reorient itself. The car slammed back on the highway wheels first and continued the chase as if nothing happened. The villains who bore witness to that collectively paled. And if you listened very closely, you could hear their hearts slamming against their ribcage. The car gained on them and moved to the transport side. The driver and Freak look out the same window, the driver gaping at the car while the other looks amused. The car swerved left and then right, ramming the transport. The villains in the back were thrown to the wall of the transport, while the two in front jolted to the right. The smaller vehicle, in a show of surprising strength, began pushing the transport towards the barricades. The driver tried desperately to get out of the position, but just couldn't push back against the fire car. The transport eventually got right next to the barricade, and the car swerved left before slamming right back into the side of the transport and finally sending them off the highway. He couldn't see very well. His vision was blurry, and he was sure the red he was seeing wasn't his rage. He groaned as he slowly turned his head towards the passenger seat. The Freak was still there, but slumped against the roof since she wasn't wearing her seatbelt, and a large gash was cut across her once pretty face. He looked down, up. He didn't think it mattered. He attempted to fiddle with the seatbelt until he heard an engine. His eyes darted out the window. The grass was the sky, while the sky was the grass. A muscle car rumbled to a stop near the transport. He assumed it was the heroes and resigned himself to be arrested until the driver stepped out of the car. Whatever he was assuming ground to a halt as he watched this no creature survey the wreck. He gaped at the image, not even really taking note of it. The eyes paralyzed his rational thoughts. The only thing he knew was he was dead. The creature walked at a slow and steady pace toward the transport. It seemed to flick its head from the front to the back sporadically, as if it couldn't decide which direction it wanted to face. The creature suddenly disappeared from sight. He freaked out. The creature didn't even do anything flashy or show how. It was just gone. A groan of metal caught his attention. He couldn't look behind him, but could tell it was the back doors. A crash sounded through the transport as, he assumed, the door's hinges were torn off. He could feel a heat wave wash over him. He didn't know what had happened, but considering the creature's appearance, it was most likely the villains in the back were being torched. A cough caught his attention as he maneuvered his head toward the Freak. She was awake and in pain. The earlier blush was somehow still present on her, and it looked as if it intensified at her pain. If he was capable, he was sure gagging, and being generally disgusted noises would be his go-to. But he just stared with half-lidded eyes. The sound of glass and grass being crushed sounded from the Freak's side of the transport. He watched as she looked over towards the window in time to see a pair of burned high tops appear. He didn't really see how the Freak was dragged out of the transport, as his vision kept failing him. The last thing he felt was the fire finally flowing over him. He didn't have the energy to scream. The heroes eventually make it to the site of the crash. Rocklock stops the car and stares at the leftover inferno. He looks at the hero that was in his passenger seat. "Call the police." The hero nodded and flipped out his phone. "Yeah, we need officers and firefighters on site." 30 minutes later, several officers, firefighters, and detectives get to the scene and begin an examination. A detective looked over the damage to the transport. The fire was put out a few minutes ago, so they could examine it now. A forensics specialist walks over, and the detective greets her. "So what do you have so far?" he asked. "Well, we've found 4 bodies, most male and only 1 female. All have severe burn tissue reminiscent of being trapped in a burning house. We found the driver hanging from what was left of the seatbelt, which didn't exactly save him. The others were burned so badly we doubt anyone could recognize them if asked. We'll need to take them to the lab to identify them," she reported. "Kami, so we're dealing with a sick bastard with a fire quirk," the detective said. Yes, but there's something else." The detective motioned for her to keep going. "The female victim was taken from the vehicle. We found drag marks leading from the transport to a small ditch where her body was found. The sides of her face have burn marks in the shape of fingers, and it seems her eyes have been dried and shriveled in the sockets. Also, the pupils looked faded and gray." The detective grimaces at the description. He looks over the scene and watches as the corpses are loaded into body bags and forensics look at the doors and the burned tire tracks off to the side. His gaze lands on the metal security doors that lay near the transport off their hinges. He suspected they could have been torn off from the handprints on the doors. The weirdest thing, though, is the shape of the prints. Skeletal. The triplets were sound asleep in their room. The sun had entered the room through the blinds hours ago, but the 3 deep sleepers were not bothered. Izuki was tucked under her sheets with a peaceful look. Izuka was much the same, though some smoke puffed out of her nose. Izumi was sprawled out and hanging upside down from her bed. Her hair covered her face and blew away as she snored heavily, wisps of smoke coming from her mouth as well. The triplets were not bothered by the smoke, as Enko and Hisashi had a special air filtration system installed. The smoke would be pulled out through the vents and puffed into a purifier. The somewhat quiet room was shattered when Enko's voice rang through the apartment. "My baby." The 3 sisters all woke up at the sound of their mother. They scrambled out of their beds and rushed out of the room. They moved down the hall and froze at the sight in the door. Hisashi and Enko were both hugging a man they didn't recognize. He was slightly taller than Hisashi, maybe a few inches, with long dark green hair that reached just below his chin, which had stubble covering it, making him look very scruffy. Freckles dotted his cheeks and light shadows under his eyes. He wore what looked like a very beat-up green wool overcoat hoodie that reached his knees and had a black Henley shirt underneath, black skinny jeans, and red high tops. The man raised his head and looked at the triplets, his dim emerald eyes meeting their eyes. "Hey, troublemakers," he began. "You gonna join the hug, or just stand there watching all day?" The triplets' eyes widened as they recognized him the moment he said that one word. "Izu." They all yelled as they rushed to join the hug, nearly knocking the other 3 over. They didn't care to ask questions then. They just wanted to be in his presence. Izuku Midoriya had finally come home. Izuku woke up in his car's backseat and felt the sun had a grudge against his eyes. He groaned as the sun shone in his face. He put his hand up to block it out. As he reached into his pocket for his phone, he grabbed it and brought it to his face to check the time, 7:32. Izuku stared at the time and mentally cursed his internal clock, but got up anyway. He looked around at the parking lot and the buildings surrounding him. Izuku couldn't help the smile that came to his lips. Izuku was home. The buildings hadn't changed much, and he was hungry for exploration. His thoughts decided to wander back to last night, and he couldn't help but smile. He and his family reunited. They had stayed in their hug for a solid few minutes before they began hounding him, obviously, and he did his best to answer most of their questions. They mostly asked the important one: where had he been? He had told them most of the truth. Some things he would not be telling them because they'd probably learn of it in the next 8 months. Izuku frowned when his trip down yesterday lane brought him to the one question he didn't know if he could answer. And of course, it was asked by Izuki. Why did you leave? Izuku sighed as he remembered his answer. He hadn't wanted the reunion to be filled with an air of guilt and remorse, but his answer did that anyway. He, with great reluctance, had explained to his family the problems he had with them. The overprotectiveness, the slight favoritism towards the triplets, and Inko and Hisashi's general ruining of opportunities that were now long gone. Izuku didn't go into details about the anger he had felt towards the twins. He just couldn't. He instead went on about the slowly building frustration over the years. And when Hisashi and Inko had attempted to keep him out of college, he snapped. Looking at his family as he told them that he could see the guilt in their eyes and the mild frustration that was pointed at themselves. He didn't want to do that. The years he had been gone had lessened his anger and frustration. He still didn't like what they did and would never forget or forgive that. But he still cared for his family. Izuku had also brought up a point he knew would be difficult for them, but still had to be done. He wouldn't be living with them. They had very obviously disliked this decision, but he had explained that after college he had lived in America on his own for 4 years. He could live on his own, and they needed to give him space as that was one of the many reasons he left. Inko and Hisashi had been the most against the idea, but after the triplets took them to their room to talk they'd come back and agreed with Izuku. Afterward, they had begun catching up and Izuku learned Izuka. Izumi and Izuki had been accepted in the hero course of UA. He would be lying if he said he hadn't been happy for them. They had also learned about Izuku's travels after college and found some of the few stories he told about America to be interesting. Izuku shook his head and climbed over his seats to the front while grabbing his coat. The overcoat had seen better days, he'd admit, but he couldn't see himself parting from it. He'd just grown attached to it. Izuku stepped out of the car and stretched his arms out, groaning when he felt his back pop. Izuku walked up to the apartment's main entrance and walked past the receptionist who had watched him as he got in the elevator. Izuku winked at her as the doors closed. Izuku rode the elevator up and swayed his head slightly to the music playing in it. The doors parted and Izuku walked out and straight for the Midoriya apartment. Izuku stopped at the door and knocked with a small 2-tap rhythm. He waited a few moments before the door opened, and he was met by a recently woken up Izumi, if the way her hair was frazzled said anything. She looked at him with the same tired and disinterested eyes he remembered as her tired mode. "Hey, Izumi, mind if I come?" Izuku was cut off by Izumi slowly hugging him and steadily increasing the strength she put into the hug. "I'm not gonna lie. For a little bit after I woke up, I thought I dreamed you coming back," Izumi said in a very flat voice that anyone else would think she didn't care, though Izuku knew better. Izumi was always the kind of person who wasn't awake until an hour after waking up. Izuku smiled and ruffled her already frazzled hair, and slowly walked him and her into the apartment, Izumi still not letting go. He waddled into the kitchen and saw Inko and Hisashi getting ready for work. "Hey guys," Izuku called out. Hisashi glanced at him, and Izuku could tell he was happy just seeing him. Inko showed it much more if the eyes filled with warmth and Gigawatt smile said anything. "Hello, Izuku," Inko said. She looked down at Izumi, who was still latching onto Izuku. "Hello, Izumi." Izumi grunted back in response. "So I guess you two are getting ready for work?" Izuku asked. "Yep," Hisashi said, popping the pea. He was currently putting on his black blazer. Izuku looked over at the TV that was showing the news, and he stared at the scene he recognized. He dragged the woman out of the transport and hoisted her up. She stared at him with a lustful expression. He stared back with flaming fury as he watched her memories of the innocents she'd murdered and raped. Slowly her expression went from lustful to genuine fear. Her iris slowly swirled as the blue drained and her eyes turned gray. Izuku snapped himself out of the memory and looked back at Inko, who was now watching the news. "Dreadful. Whoever did this is sick and should be thrown in Tartarus." Izuku just looked back at the screen and watched a reporter talk with the wreckage visible behind her. "Yeah," Izuku said. Izuku stayed at the apartment and watch TV after Hisashi and Inko left. They asked him to watch over the triplets, and he agreed. Izumi had let go of Izuku after her brain finally woke up, and she had bounded for the bathroom. Izuka came from Izumi's direction, seeming to have just taken a shower herself. She plopped down on the couch next to him and seemed to zone out. Izuku continued watching the news and soon found Izuki had sat down on the couch with a similar frazzled look to Izumi. Eventually, Izumi joined the sibling couch party, and they all watched the TV, at one point watching an anime slice of life episode that Izuka recommended. Izumi interrupted the party when her phone buzzed. She answered, and Izuku was shocked to hear the sensual words coming out of her mouth. Izuka and Izuki just gagged dramatically. Izuku couldn't help the brotherly instinct that popped up, and made a mental checklist to make sure this Bakugo kid was on the straight and narrow. Izumi stayed on call for a few minutes before hanging up and staring at Izuku. He soon found himself leaning on the elevator rails as the triplets talked amongst themselves. Izumi and Izuka were going over to the guy she was talking to's house, while Izuki wanted to head to a music store that apparently was the home of one of her friends. They got to the ground floor, and the siblings all walked out of the apartment. "So where's your car, bro?" Izumi asked while looking over the parking lot. Izuku tried to say something, but Izuka got to it first. "It's probably the van." Izuka pointed to a white van that was one spray-painted word away from being a red flag. "Yeah, that makes sense," Izumi smiled at Izuku. "So, you have any candy in that van?" Izuku stared at the triplets with a deadpan expression as he slowly pulled his keys out of his coat. Izuku looked them dead in the eyes and pressed the button to unlock his car. A loud beep signaled a car being unlocked, and the triplets looked over towards the noise. Their eyes widened as Izuku grew a smirk. "That's my car." Sitting in a spot a few slots away from the van was a beast waiting for its master. The Plymouth sat there as the siblings approached. Well, Izuku sauntered over as the triplets ran over and began looking over the car. "This is so cool," Izuki yelled with stars in her eyes as she looked at the red decals on the door. "This car is the definition of fire," Izumi screeched as she looked over the hood with the double vents, letting her get a glimpse at the engine. Izuku looked through the windows at the interior, the chocolate brown leather seats, and the red crystal demon as the shift knob. She looked back at Izuku and asked, "How did you get this?" "Simple really," Izuku said. "I raced someone who believed if you could beat him in a race, you deserved the car more than anyone else." Izuku smirked with pride at the accomplishment. The triplets could tell there was a story behind that, but before any of them could voice a question, Izuku raised his hand and said, "And I will not be telling you the story." He raised his hand again as the triplets voiced their displeasure. "Because it's a very inappropriate story for your young minds, and I don't feel like telling." "Awa, come on." "All right." "Are you sure?" Izuku smiled. "Yes, Izuki, I'm sure. Now get in the car." The triplets nodded, and all of them climbed into the Plymouth, and off they went. After Izuku dropped Izumi and Izuka off at the Bakugo household and dropped Izuki off at the music store, Izuku decided to reacquaint himself with Mustafa. He drove past old hangout spots that were either the same or, in one case, an arcade-turned-mattress store. One of the most profound things he noticed was the hero's presence in the city. He couldn't go 3 blocks without seeing a patrolling hero. It somewhat annoyed him to see so many, as it made things far more difficult, but also proved he wouldn't have much to do these next few months. Cruising around in the Plymouth also didn't go unnoticed by several people walking by. He often caught someone looking at the car in his peripheral. He smirked in pride at his car. The Plymouth GTX, which was modeled after the 1970s variant, was his prized possession. It was a part of a set of 6 cars made 20 years ago, each modeled after an old American muscle car. Each one had a nickname, and this one was called the Hell Walker. Of course, this also caused a few issues, as these cars had been known to be a target for thieves, and he hoped that the triplets don't learn that, as then his parents would learn that. and they'd probably try to convince him to get rid of it. Izuku sighed at the bitter thought. He couldn't help thinking like that sometimes. Even away from his family, some of those thoughts never really left his mind. He didn't know why, but he just couldn't seem to let that go. Seeing a therapist wasn't an option, as they'd probably check him in the system. And soon he's an illegal immigrant. Yeah, therapy wasn't in the cards. Izuku turned onto another street absent-mindedly and saw something that made his heart pang in longing. A building stood on a corner. The walls were a faded pink that he remembered being painted several years ago. Some people would just brush it off as a normal car repair store, but Izuku was always at home there. He glanced at the sign in front as he got closer. Hatsume Repair Depot. He wanted so badly to turn into the parking lot and see his old teacher. But he knew it'd break Ren's heart to see him leave. Izuku wasn't exactly optimistic about his staying in Japan plan. The only reason he was able to hide who he was that he was always moving, never staying in one place for more than a few months. Plus, being officially quirkless helped him out of a lot of times he was nearly caught, as some people couldn't see past that, so he was thankful for his crippled status. Izuku had to be careful. He wanted to see the people he cared about. But Ren was different. He was much more car smart than people gave him credit for. Izuku recalled a time when 2 mangled and fused cars were brought into the shop once, and he could immediately recognize the make and year simply at a glance. He couldn't risk him being capable of recognizing the Hell Walker, so with a heavy heart he continued driving. Still driving around, Izuku eventually found himself on the south side of Mustafa. The south side was more of a slum than most people would admit. It was also the home to several underground fighting rings that he enjoyed participating in. He momentarily wondered if any of them would still be around after all this time. Izuku glanced out the windows and watched as some homeless wandered the streets. Izuku felt he could relate to them, considering he hasn't really had a home for the past 4 years. He was beginning to turn when his senses flared. He stomped on the brakes and snapped his head to an alley. Izuku could sense the wrath and lust oozing from the alley. His eyes widened at the realization before he narrowed his eyes and snarled. Izuku put the car in reverse and backed up to the alley. He stopped and shifted to park. Izuku exited the Plymouth, but made to pop the trunk. He walked over and opened it. Izuku rummaged through the junk and extra clothes until he cleared the tire compartment. He popped it open and grabbed the sawed-off Remington 870. He didn't need his powers for this. Izuku checked the safety and switched it off. He moved towards the alley and felt the sins get stronger. He turned a corner and felt ice-cold rage. A man with blue scales was on top of some poor woman. Her clothes were strewn about, obviously being torn off. Izuku didn't hesitate and hip-fired the Remington at the man's chest. The man fell back and groaned. Izuku moved forward as the guy slowly tried to get up, the scales being far stronger than believed. Izuku stepped on the man's chest and pushed him back down. The man's purple eyes stared fearfully at him. "See, come on, pal, wa," he tried to say. Izuku unloaded buckshot into the man's face and silenced the rapist. Izuku whipped his head back to the woman. She was still laying down, bare to the world. He got closer and grabbed a large piece of torn cloth, which he assumed was her shirt, and draped it over her nude form. She didn't react. She simply stared forward with somewhat glazed eyes. Izuku knew she was alive, so she had to be in shock. He wasn't exactly great with psychological problems. He had enough of them to deal with. So he decided it would be best to get her to a hospital and hope the professionals could help. Izuku went to her side and crouched down. She barely batted an eye as he picked her up and walked out of the alley. Izuku put the girl in the passenger seat and buckled her up. He put the shotgun back in the extra tire compartment and jumped in the driver's seat. Izuku raced through the city and hoped he wouldn't be pulled over. He really didn't want to deal with the cops. Izuku was very focused on the road, but he could tell the girl was somewhat looking at him. At least she's somewhat responding to the environment around her, Izuku thought. He continued through the city and eventually arrived at Mustafa General Hospital. Izuku got out of the car and went over to the passenger door. Izuku picked up the woman and rushed for the emergency doors. He entered the emergency doors. "Help! This girl needs help." The doctors at the desk turned towards him, and upon seeing the woman in his arms rushed over. "What happened?" the doctor asked quickly. "She was raped." Izuku noticed the flash of disgust and anger flash through the doctor's eyes. She turned and yelled for a stretcher. A few doctors ran over, one with a wheelchair. Izuku placed the woman in the chair and watched as she was wheeled away. Izuku left after that, not wanting anyone to question him further. Izuku circled back and picked up the triplets before heading to the apartment. And by the time they got back, Hisashi and Inko had come back from work. The family had dinner and talked about their days, Izuku telling them a few things about America, and eventually, everyone found themselves doing something in the home. Izuku had found himself walking to his old room. He stepped inside and turned on the light. He was a little surprised at how untouched the room was. Izuku dragged his finger over his old desk and displaced the dust that had accumulated over the 6 years the room wasn't used. Izuku walked over to his bed and crouched down to look under it, and he found what he was looking for. He reached and grabbed the small crate before pulling it out. Izuku felt very nostalgic looking at the 10 notebooks in the crate. He reached in and pulled out the very dusty notebook before dusting it off with his hand and reading the title, Future Hero Analysis #1. Izuku opened the notebook and began to read the old entry. Izuku stayed in the room reading for about an hour and had gotten to the 6th notebook. He closed the notebook and put the rest back in the crate. He lifted the crate up and walked towards the door. Izuku ignored the mirror he walked past, even as it showed a skeleton rather than the person who walked past. 3 months. Izuku was running out of time. He had to get out of Mustafa in the next few weeks, or it'd experience a rather searing heatwave. Izuku was lucky that the triplets were starting soon, so he was able to drive them to their first day as he wanted, but would have to sacrifice it being every day, as their first week was when he'd be leaving. "You're what?" Izumi reacted about as he expected. Inko and Hisashi looked absolutely torn up, and Izuki had tears in their eyes. "Not like that," Izuku quickly said. "I mean, I'm going for a drive across Japan to explore the place, okay?" They still stared at him, obviously demanding an explanation. Izuku groaned. "Look, back in the US, I'd do these little trips across the country. I always did these every few months and I enjoyed them. The point of it originally was to get away from my problems for a week, but after a while, I just kept doing them until I did them every 3 months." Izuku stopped to let his words sink in. Inko and Hisashi looked less torn and more in thought. The triplets were still staring at him, but a glimmer of understanding in their eyes told him he was on the right track. "It's become a tradition for me to do these types of drive. I'd be gone for a week, maybe 2, and that's it. Plus, I've been itching to explore Japan for a while, and this just happens to coincide." He watched his family's reactions and saw a blanket of understanding place itself in their eyes. Izuki was the first to speak up. "So you'll be back?" "Yes, I'll be gone for a week, 2 tops," Izuku said. Izuki nodded and looked at her sisters. Izumi still looked somewhat frustrated, and Izuka wore a mask of indifference, though it didn't hide the turmoil of thought her eyes showed. "You have to promise." Izuku looked at Izumi, finally saying something. Izuku raised a hand. "I promise I will come back within the allotted time frame." Izumi nodded her head. "You'll call as well, right?" Izuka asked. Izuku froze and could only think of one word: shit. Getting his family off his back, Izuku went about the rest of the week rather well. Izuku wouldn't do much around the apartment and would usually be out walking or driving. He also rediscovered his favorite noodle shop. The owners recognized him and welcomed him with open arms. He'd be sure to go there when possible. The triplets also started their high school careers at And he made sure to drive them there their first day. The day went by pretty slowly, and when he came to pick them up, they told him all about their day, though Izuki's day seemed far tamer compared to Izumi's and Izuka's. Their homeroom teacher Shota Aizawa, he felt he recognized that name, was a real slave driver. The day consisted of the entire class doing a quirk apprehension test, and apparently, he had threatened the whole class with expulsion. Izuki was listening intently and Izuku was more focused on the road, but still listened. Izuku couldn't really fault the guy's method. It may seem cruel to them, but that was because the horror of the world hadn't truly sunk into their minds, and he knew it wouldn't take that long for that to happen. He was surprised to hear that it was a ruse to get everyone to do their best. He was sure the story would have ended with at least one of them getting the boot. Maybe the invisible girl Izumi mentioned. Izuki's day resembled his first day the most, an orientation with the principal giving a speech and learning about their classes. Her day consisted of the teacher Sekijiro explaining their schedules and what they could expect from the hero course. Izuku felt her class would be a very textbook one compared to Izuka's and Izumi's, so she may not be exposed to the evils just yet. He'd take the win. The rest of the day had been quiet and night soon came. He made sure to tell his family when he was leaving, and the triplets made sure to hug him and threatened to hunt him if he wasn't back in 2 weeks. Izuku had currently been driving for several hours and had finally gotten close enough to feel the pulse he had made sure to place on the rig. The pulse was a sharp feeling of heat. He wasn't affected, but he could still sense it. He could also feel the scratching that had finally made itself known. It was faint, very faint, as if he were listening to something being scratched at behind something. He knew it wouldn't be long now as he turned off the road and into the trees. Izuku made sure the Plymouth was deep enough to where no one would see it, and then he shut the engine off and got out. Usually, Izuku would take the Plymouth to the rig as well, but it was too late for him to use his powers without setting it loose. He pats the hood of the car in a manner that would assume he was patting a child. And with that, he set off deeper into the woods, leaving the Plymouth behind. The trek into the forest was peaceful. It almost made him forget why he was there. Izuku shook his head as a scratching noise made it to his ears, but quickened his pace anyway. Izuku had gotten halfway to his destination when he smelled something only described as sulfur and ash. He immediately knew what that meant and brought up his hand. Izuku stared at his ash-ridden fingers, and how the ash would blow away, revealing the skeleton beneath. 5 years ago, Izuku would have freaked out seeing this. Now it just meant he was running out of time. Izuku eventually made it to a clearing, and almost sighed with relief seeing the rig parked there. The rig was an older semi-truck. He didn't actually know how old, as the previous owner had only mentioned. It was nearly 80 years old when he got it, so he just assumed it was made in the late 21st century. Izuku stumbled toward the trailer doors. He grabbed the bolt, keeping it closed, and slid it out. Izuku heaved the doors open before climbing in. The front of the trailer had a line of heavy-duty straps on the wall, and hooks on the floor several feet away from each other. The middle looked like a small workbench, wrenches, screwdrivers, and several others put in drawers on one wall, and parallel to that a small armory of weapons. Izuku wasn't interested in those, however, as he shuffled toward the far back of the trailer. Izuku made a beeline straight for an old and dismantled bike, the Armstrong MT-500. Izuku finally can't take it, and collapses a few steps from the bike, his pores leaking dark smoke. He crawls towards the bike and drags the leather jacket draped over it closer to him. Hee, well, I guess it's your show now. Izuku smiles crazily as flames begin piercing his temple. Just do me a favor, stay out of Mustafu, Izuku says, as his jaw burns away to the bone beneath. Izuku twitched as he just began to laugh. This was the transition between drivers. Izuku was consumed by the black smoke, and his laugh slowly died out. Silence reigned for a moment before movement caused the smoke to shift. An orange glow pierced the smoke as it slowly vented out of the trailer through the small openings in the side. A figure walked out of the smoke, its charred black skull and charred jacket making it look menacing. The rider was here, and it wouldn't be showing mercy. The party was regal and proper. Koichi felt as out of place as a guy could in the tux he wore. It definitely wasn't the many villains surrounding him at the party. Koichi really wanted to tear the suit off and take these villains to one-way beat-down street, but held back on the impulse for the mission. Koichi Hamawari, Aka the Crawler, was gliding through the crowd. His thoughts kept crawling back to the villain he was here to take down and the impact it would have on the Naruhata ward. He finally made it to a table and looked at his partner in vigilantism, Knuckleduster. Knuckleduster wasn't wearing his normal attire, but instead a cleanly pressed black tux, his mask being tucked and folded into his breast pocket. He leaned on a wooden cane in his left hand, an injury from a while back in age catching up to him, having messed up his leg a bit. Koichi grabbed a glass from the table and took a small sip. "Have you seen the target?" Knuckleduster didn't answer verbally, but motioned to the grand staircase. Koichi looked up the steps and found the target. Dressed in a snow-white suit with a blood-red tie was the villain Starstruck. Starstruck had rolled in a few years ago and quickly took all drug rackets in Tokyo's Naruhata ward. His quirk allowed him to create superheated balls of plasma in his hands, hence the name Starstruck. Recently, rumors had spread that he was supplying Trigger to a Yakuza group in the area, though the rumors were debated on which one. Koichi looked at Knuckleduster and nodded at him. He nodded back and walked away. Koichi walked back through the crowd and towards a balcony. He entered the cold night, the breeze somewhat ruffling his hair. Koichi stood and soaked the night in. He always loved the coolness of night, no matter what people said. Cold is superior to heat. Koichi looked around to make sure no one could see him. After making sure no one would see him, he walked to the wall and put his hands on them. He activated his quirk and scaled the wall easily. Koichi eventually reached an open window and climbed inside. He looked around at the crates and boxes littering the place. Koichi walked through the attic and eventually heard voices. He ducked behind a box to listen to two guards talking to each other. "That's what I'm saying. The shipment was attacked," the left guard said. "How?" "That shipment was kept secret from the heroes. Our police contacts made sure of that," the right guard said. "I don't know, man. All I know is the boss is going to be pissed when he hears about this, and we're probably going to have a need for a few new paid officers." Koichi had been confused when he heard this. He thought the shipment was next week, but also the fact it was attacked meant he and Knuckleduster's job was done for them. He didn't know how to feel about that. More importantly, he wondered who had gotten to the shipment first. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a loud engine that seemed to get closer. The guards must have heard it too as they tensed and grabbed their walkie-talkies. "Yo, what's that noise?" He didn't get to finish as an orange light flashed from the street, and a loud crash sounded from the ballroom below. Koichi and the guards were caught off guard, and Koichi tripped on his feet and alerted the guards to his presence. "Crap," Koichi said. Knuckleduster had seen many things in his life, but a skeleton biker with his head on fire took the number 2 spot. He, like many of the patrons, had heard the growing roar of an engine getting closer. He had glanced up to Starstruck and saw him talking to his personal guards about something. He seemed pretty miffed too. And then a bright orange flash filled the room, and the sound of shattering glass and screams filled his ears. He blinked as his vision came back, and narrowed his eyes at the sight in front of him. An inferno of orange and a white skull, with a leather jacket that seemed to be melting and charred. He could have sworn he saw the jacket actually bubble in a few places. The rider scanned the room, its gaze making everyone shake in fear. A primal instinct to survive flaring. Finally, its gaze fell on Starstruck, and it just stared. Seconds passed and Starstruck grew a spine. "Kill him," he roared, activating his quirk. Gunfire ripped through the air, and Knuckleduster dove behind a table to avoid getting hit. The rider stood its ground, letting the projectiles hit it. A few quills from someone's quirk aimed at its skull melted before they hit their target, and through it all the rider stared. Starstruck charged up a plasma sphere and aimed it towards the rider. He smirked before chucking it. The sphere soared towards the rider, which showed no reaction. It got closer and closer, and finally, the rider's hand struck out, catching the superheated plasma sphere. Everything went quiet. Knuckleduster looked around at the attendants and guards, all of them gaping at the rider holding something so hot it could melt through several inches of thick steel. The rider looked at the sphere, tossed it around with its hands, and added its own fire to the sphere. Starstruck started shaking, and the rider seemed to present the sphere, now blue in color and wisping off in any general direction. Ha, the rider chuckled raspily. It spun on the ball of its foot and threw the plasma ball back at Starstruck. The ball flew through the air as it left a trail of blue, and the floor underneath caught fire. People it passed were set ablaze and screamed in agony as the fire ate away at them. Starstruck attempted to catch the ball, but found his hands burning as he reached out. Ah, he screamed before the ball slammed into his chest. The heat was too much for his body to handle as the flesh, muscle, nerves, and bone all turned to ash. Screams and frantic footfalls towards the doors were the only noises Knuckleduster could hear. He watched the crowd try to leave, but was intercepted by the Armstrong moving itself in front of the door, chains oozing from its exhaust pipe and anchoring itself to the wall. Fire erupted from the floor and flooded the guards, somehow missing Knuckleduster as he stood close to the guards. He reached for his mask and put it on before he moved towards the rider and got close enough to see it turn its head at him. Knuckleduster raised the cane and swung it hard. Crack! The rider's head snapped away from Knuckleduster as the cane broke from the force. Sorry, Matchstick. Can't let you kill any more people, Knuckleduster yelled. The rider looked back at Knuckleduster, and its jaw was hanging from one side. The sight made him grin. The rider grabbed its jaw and snapped it back into place. There went Knuckleduster's smirk. Knuckleduster reared a fist back, but a chain snaked around his forearm and yanked him off the ground. He struggled as the chains wrapped him up and suspended him above the room. The rider ignored him in favor of the people trying to leave. It walked forward, knuckle style, and was socked across the temple by Koichi. I won't let you hurt those people, he exclaimed. The rider was sent flying across the hall and directly into the stairs, and a small crater formed behind the rider's body. A beat passed as the rider lay there before it slowly got up and stared into the vigilante's eyes, not without brushing off his shoulder, even though the concrete was melted away already. Koichi activated his quirk and sped towards the rider, holding up his hands. Shooty G, Koichi tried to yell, but a hand clamped over his mouth. Koichi's eyes widened. The rider had moved so fast he hadn't even seen it move. One moment it's in front of the pillar, and the next he's being held off the ground by his jaw. He clawed at the hand to try to get it off, but the rider's grip was ironclad. Shut up, the rider rasped. Koichi felt cold snakes creep across his chest and was soon pulled out of the rider's grip and up above the floor. The chains pulled until he was near Knuckleduster. The rider returned his gaze to the crowd of people all shaking in terror. He walked closer even as the vigilantes tried to get its attention back on them. They were both wasting their time, and they weren't drenched in sin. Both had what it had considered a hero's soul. The rider stopped and gazed over the crowd, singling them out. They continued begging for mercy, squealing like pigs to slaughter. It ignored their pleas as it continued the observation: greed, wrath, sloth, lust. They were all guilty. Everyone in the crowd was a criminal of the worst regard, and no mercy was shed for their victims. So why should it shed any? The rider roared fire at the crowd, its jaw opening unnaturally. Screams and cries of the depraved were like a symphony to the rider. It continued unleashing fire upon the crowd until only the noise of the roaring flames remained. The rider clamped its jaw shut and dispelled the fire. Ash and some fragments of bone were all that remained. The rider could sense the dread from its vigilante captives. Surprisingly, it was more for the victims than themselves. It put the vigilantes out of its mind as its senses flared. The rider brought its hand up and rubbed the left palm with its right hand. Its head snapped in the direction of the sin. The Armstrong drove up beside the rider and it hopped on. But before leaving, it unraveled the chains keeping the vigilantes bound and sped off back out the hole it came. Knuckleduster and Koichi lay there both deep in thought about the villain that had crashed their operation. Different scenarios and reasons circled through their minds, but one thing was prevalent. Why didn't he kill us? Izuku stood in a large and beautiful chamber. Izuku was confused for a moment before too. What he assumed, guards ran by. He took note of their garments and assumed he was somewhere in ancient Egypt. The guards didn't take note of Izuku as they ran towards a large throne that had appeared from fire. Izuku got closer and could only listen as the guards talked to the man sitting on the throne. He couldn't understand them, but he could tell they were panicking. The man didn't seem worried though. Izuku decided to take a look around at the architecture. He had been to Egypt once and found it to be quite beautiful. The golden arches that held the ceramic roof and the many hieroglyphics decorated the walls. He cursed that he couldn't use his notebook. Izuku finally looked back at the guards and man. They were still talking when an explosion rocked the place. Izuku watched as the man still stayed calm, with an almost arrogant smile on his face. The guards were panicking. Their spears pointed toward the grand doors. The doors blew open. Fire streamed into the room, scorching the walls and floor. The guards leapt back from the flames and still shakily pointed their weapons at the door. Izuku wasn't really surprised that fanaticism will go a long way even in the face of death. Out of the fire came a somewhat feminine figure, an ashen white cloak that was longer in the back. Her torso and legs were covered by a more white cloth. Izuku looked at the figure and smiled. He had an idea what this was, not just because of the flaming skeleton. Izuku watched as the ancient rider strode through the hall. The man on the throne was still arrogantly smiling as the other two quaked in their sandals. The rider walked right up to them. It glanced at the two and seemed to snarl in the same language the other three had used. It seemed whatever the rider said finally shattered their resolve, and both ran out of the room. Izuku stared at the two running away. Izuku was always surprised when the rider spared people. It didn't happen often in these dream memories, and it never happened with him. When the rider was locked onto a target, it'd kill everyone working for them. The man, who by now he just assumed was some kind of pharaoh or something, leaned on his arm and spoke with an arrogant tone that just made Izuku want to wrap him up with his chain. The pharaoh continued to speak as the rider got closer. The spirit ignored every word and continued up the path. Izuku followed after watching the environment slowly burn away into a void of flowing ash. The pharaoh stopped with a smirk as the rider stood directly in front of them. They stood for a moment before reaching out and violently hoisting the pharaoh up by the neck. The pharaoh finally lost the smirk and frantically began saying something. The rider didn't care as they forced the pharaoh to look them in the eye. Izuku rubbed his hands together in anticipation. He always loved seeing it from an outsider's paw. The pharaoh's face twisted in agony as the rider opened their mouth. His eyes began losing their blue shine and slowly turned gray. A blue light spewed from his eyes and into the rider's mouth. Its mouth shut with an audible click. The rider looked at the soulless corpse and let it fall as the flowing ash flooded Izuku, and everything went black. Izuku slowly oozed back into consciousness. He wished he didn't immediately as a splitting headache made itself known. If there was one thing Izuku really hated about the rider being in control for a straight week, it was the goddamn headache afterward. At least it was better than the first few times. He really hated those months. Izuku chose to keep his eyes closed and just ride it out. They never lasted very long. Eventually, the headache went from splitting to manageable. He slowly opened his eyes and found himself in a rather dilapidated church. It was also slanted somewhat with sunlight bleeding through cracks in the ceiling. Izuku pushed himself up and found he was on the stage where he assumed the preacher would stand and preach the gospel. He also took note of the fact that it was somewhat ironic that he tended to find himself wrapped up in religion. The writer itself could be considered a demon, and he thought it was originally as well, but it was quick to give a very vague and convoluted answer that only answered one question, and that it wasn't a demon or anything human-related. Still wouldn't answer him with words, though. He looked around for a moment at the church, studying its features until he finally stood up and cracked his neck. He'd definitely be putting this place in his notebook. Izuku made his way past the rotted chairs and dusty stone statues toward the entrance. He put his hand up to block the sun from trying to kill his eyes. He moved into the morning sun and looked around. The first thing he noticed was the Armstrong resting against the brick wall of the church, and the fact that said church was definitely sunk into the ground. He walked to the Armstrong and momentarily looked it over. The writer's powers tended to fix most broken things back to their original state. Because of that, he had begun gutting the Armstrong for parts and selling them to people who need them. He opened the saddlebag hanging off it and grabbed a notebook marked Wonders of the World #13. Izuku flipped it open and walked toward the center of the clearing and turned toward the church once he reaches it. Izuku makes a small doodle of the church and writes about how he found it and a few possibilities for its future. He stopped and momentarily thought about bringing the rig here. He thought about the pluses and realized the church could work as a home for him in Japan. With that thought, Izuku walked back into the church and began muttering to himself about placements. The weapons could go there. He moved from the small altar with a faded mural of the Virgin Mary. The rig could probably be parked on the side, and the old storeroom on the west wing could have the wall torn down and used as a garage. Izuku walked through the storeroom, which was mostly barren, and the only reason he knew it was the storeroom was because of the hanging plaque on the door. Izuku wrote down all the ideas he had, and then closed the book before returning to the Armstrong. He puts it back in the saddlebag before taking another thing out of the saddlebag, a matte black biker helmet, and hopped on the bike. Izuku places the helmet on his head and turns towards the woods, scanning the tree line and looking for the path the rider took here. His eyes finally land on a rather scorched path that was burned by the Armstrong. He turns the bike and drives through the path. The trail stretched on for close to an hour if Izuku was counting right, but eventually he came to a gravel road. Izuku stopped and looked down the sides of the road, trying to decide which way he should go. Shrugging, he turns right and speeds off. The gravel road eventually takes him to a highway that he follows until he hits a town and drives around to find a library or some kind of computer place so he could use a computer. He needed to know the damage the writer had caused. And since he barely even got fuzzy memories from his time being possessed, he really needed to see the news. Izuku rolled to a stop on the side parking of several buildings. He turned the engine off and kicked the stand down so the bike didn't fall. He looked around at the people walking around. He was pleasantly surprised to see no one looking at the Armstrong in recognition. Most didn't even look at it, just moving off to wherever they were going. Izuku took the helmet off and placed it in the saddlebag before walking toward the store he had stopped for. Izuku walked through the sliding doors of the store and waved towards the cashier, who waved back before walking towards a sign reading computers. Izuku walked over to a display of several laptops. He opened one up and the screen powered on to show a system locked pop-up. Izuku looked around and put his hand on the screen. The screen glowed orange, and then the system lock lifted. Izuku signed in as a guest and brought up Rugal. Izuku scrolled to the news and clicked on the tab. Flaming skeleton villain terrorizes northern Japan. Drug lords murdered by metal album cover reject. Known vigilantes in Tokyo scene, escaping scene of the skeleton villain's second massacre. The HPSC releases statement on the rampage of the skeleton villain. Izuku stared at the first few things that popped up and hung his head while releasing a sigh. Got him. Sir Nitai looked up from the folders and over the table, observing the heroes that had arrived for this meeting. Most of them are talking amongst themselves or staying away from people waiting for the meeting to start. He looked back at the folders and gets everyone's attention by tapping his high-density seals on the table. "Hello, I'm sure you all know why you are here," Sir Nightai began. "1 week ago, one of the worst villain attacks in Japan's history began. Over 38 hours ago, it finally stopped. This would usually be a call for celebration, but unfortunately, it wasn't stopped by a hero. The villain stopped his rampage and disappeared without a single sign of where he went." Nightai opened the folder and picked up a black and white photo presenting its back to the meeting. The villain is believed to be a multinational criminal, a serial killer proficient in evading capture, and has still yet to be identified. The heroes look at each other, most confused about what Nightai's getting at, while others are surprised that this villain is multinational. His identity is completely unknown, as his features are believed to be a result of a somewhat late mutant quirk awakening. Because of this, he is only known by his nickname, given by the heroes and police department in Jackson, Missouri of the United States. Sir Nightai turns the photo around and ignores the small gasps emitting from a few of the heroes. The Ghost Rider. Nightai hands out a few other photos to the heroes, and they pass them around. This meeting is to get the word out. The Rider is a very dangerous individual with a powerful quirk and the will to use it. Nightai grabs a remote and turns towards a screen. He presses a button, and the screen displays a newspaper report from America, translated in Japanese. His first appearance seemed to show the Rider in a burnt vehicle rocketing down the freeway. At first it was believed he was just a street punk deciding he wanted to test his quirk to the limits. It was much worse than that. A hero that could keep pace with the vehicle was sent to stop him. And when the hero didn't report in after an hour, more heroes were sent, and they made a rather shocking discovery. He hit another button, and a crime scene photo popped up. Most of the heroes were shocked by the image, others were angered. The hero was murdered, but that's not what shocked people. He was dragged at nearly 100 mph on concrete, and as you can see, he was torn apart. Unfortunately, this wasn't the only casualty. Later that day, several civilians and known villains were found burned severely, and none survived. A gloved fist slammed into the table. "And you're telling us this guy hasn't been caught yet?" Nightai looked at the heroine, who yelled out, "Yes, Mirko, that's exactly what I'm saying." Mirko growled, but stayed quiet to listen to Nightai. The Ghost Rider's original rampage was sporadic and random, killing anyone that came across him. Thankfully, no kids were killed. This rampage continued across half of the US for close to 2 months. The heroes were once again shocked by this information and why they didn't know about this. Afterward, the Rider disappeared and wasn't spotted for several weeks, though where he was surprised people. Nightai pressed another button on the remote, and the screen once again changed to a map of America's continent. A red dot was shown farther north and in Canada. He somehow made it past the American-Canadian border without incident, which is a very difficult thing to do normally, and I don't need to say how difficult it'd be for a known villain. Nightai himself was surprised at this when he learned of it. The US had always been heavy-handed with their border defense. It had only increased when quirks arose, and if this villain could get past those defenses without incident, that was a very scary thought. "I have a question," a voice interrupted Nightai's thoughts. He looked at the end of the table and saw it was Edshot. "If this villain is so notorious, how haven't we heard of him?" A lot of the heroes nodded at his question and looked to Nightai for an answer. Unfortunately, it was a matter that simply didn't involve Japan, considering for the 4 years the Ghost Rider has been active. He'd only been in the Americas and occasionally Europe. It was simply not our problem in saying, of course, that has changed, and we are to receive all case files on the Rider. Nightai turns the projector to an image of the Rider caught on a highway security camera. "I've read a few files that had come over already. Most of them pertain to earlier cases, but one file was from a detective named Cyrus Blaze. He wrote down and put his own theories as to how the Rider works, and one of them serves a rather key purpose." Nightai brings up a file and looks at it. He states in the file that the Rider seems to strike very briefly, Most of the time he will show up and then disappear, but a pattern had formed a year after the first sightings. I will quote Mr. Blaze here, 3 months, that's all you'll have. The rider seems to go on a reckless rampage across the country. Every 3 months, I don't know why and I don't know if he does for kicks, we haven't stopped him. But you do your best and catch the bastard. Night Eye places the file down and looks up at the heroes gathered. Well, let us not disappoint Mr. Blaze, Endeavor spoke up. I'll personally bring him in, he declared. Most of the heroes nodded, but Night Eye looked at him and shook his head. No, everyone looked at Night Eye as if he grew a second head. It's not that I doubt your capability, I simply don't believe you'd be a good matchup. The rider, just like you, has a fire quirk, and just like you, fire doesn't seem to harm him. It most likely wouldn't be a good idea. Endeavor went to retort, but actually thought about the matchup and sat back down and grumbled in agreement, much to his own annoyance. But in regards to Mr. Blaze's request, Night Eye's eyes hardened slightly. I will make this declaration. The Ghost Rider has terrorized most of the world, and he believes he can do the same here. Well, I say he couldn't have picked a worse place to come. Japan is the modern pillar of heroism, and millions of heroes are out and patrol the country. Our very own symbol of peace. All Might is here, and Japan is the rider's next stop. But it will also be his last. 2 weeks. That hadn't felt real to Izuku. It felt like the past 2 weeks had gone by far faster than it should have. He'd moved the rig and all his stuff into the church, even knocked down that wall, and made a garage out of the storage room. All in 2 weeks. It felt strange having an actual home again. Over the past several years, he mostly drifted in the Plymouth, sleeping in the back of the car. When he got the rig, he slept in the larger cabin of the semi. Not once had he paid for a hotel room or rented a house, so it felt different, not a bad different, just different. He also couldn't help the bubble of frustration that came up when his mind decided to wander back to 2 weeks ago, when he came back from his trip. Apparently, while he was gone, villains attacked Yueya's unforeseen simulation joint and Class 1A. Izuka and Izumi got caught in that, and he was angry and frustrated that he wasn't there. The only thing that didn't make him go ballistic was the fact that neither of them had gotten hurt. But they had seen a few things that made him want to hunt down this Tamura Shigaraki and this league of villains. Unfortunately, that wasn't an option, as he couldn't risk being caught. 2 weeks hadn't even slowed the search for the Ghost Rider, and he doubted it'd stop anytime soon. Plus, the news had finally caught wind of the Rider's multinational villain status. God, the articles were filled with so much hero criticism. He felt almost sorry for the heroes who had to deal with them now. Though even if Izuku couldn't hunt Shigaraki and the League of Villains, he still marked his name in his list. Izuku never thought he'd have even written a name on the page of names he'd hunted personally while in Japan. He was so sure there wouldn't be as much crime as there was. He had read the statistics for crying out loud. They had even stated that because of All Might, and even though he wasn't as mentioned, Endeavor, the crime rate had gone down to 6% and had been rather steady the last few years. Izuku stopped his train of thought, refocused on what he was doing, and resumed securing a wire to the church wall. Izuku had been doing his best to get the church into a more livable space for himself, and one of those was electricity. He didn't need it for the internet or any quality of life things. He needed it so he could see at night without lighting his hand on fire, and so he could work with his weapons. A few years ago, Izuku rediscovered his knack for industrial manufacturing when he worked in a factory for a few months before moving on. He even made a stun button that was actually very effective, so much so that he was rather surprised when he tested it out back in the States. 1 year ago. Izuku stood with his hood up in an alleyway, writing in a small pocketbook as he muttered on about the voltage and power of the custom-made shock button. Voltage is fairly high. Not capable of killing, however, which suits my purposes as staying O. A groan of pain interrupted him. Izuku glanced down at the poor bastard, who had just tried to rob him a few minutes ago, and had become a test dummy for his shock button. Guy went down in 2 hits, the first making him grab his stomach and shrink into himself, The second one to the neck dropped him to the ground. Izuku kicked the man in the jaw, knocking him out, and continued writing, off the police and heroes' radar when not transformed. Now, Izuku would admit his engineering prowess was better with vehicles and the occasional faulty AC unit. His family had learned this as well after the specially made air filter system in the apartment was on the fritz a few days after coming back home, and he had fixed it for them. Izuku had fixed several other things around that apartment after that. If he didn't know any better, they probably saw him as some handyman they could call on whenever they wanted. Izuku moved from the now secured wire and turned towards a small gasoline generator he bought from a hardware store. Izuku rubbed his gloved hands together. Please work, switched on the generator. Please work. He turned towards the light bulbs he installed on the walls and crossed his fingers. Please work. A slight glow started in one of the bulbs and slowly the others followed before they began glowing, illuminating the room. Izuku jumped in the air, pumping his fist and cheering. Finally, took 7 tries, but I did it. Izuku had been working to get the lights on for days. The original electrical work had decayed far too heavily for him to fix, so he had to get rather simple with the wiring. The wires were secured and exposed on the walls, and the lights were mounted on wood panels. Izuku had spent a few hours getting up the first day, and the next several days were spent just trying to get the damn things to turn on. The first time he tried turning on the lights, they caught fire. The second time, the bulbs exploded, which made no sense to Izuku. The third time, they just didn't turn on. The fourth was the reason he was now wearing gloves. The fifth, he didn't even want to remember. The sixth was the reason he was resecuring the wires. All in all, he was really happy the seventh didn't destroy the church. A buzzing noise caught his attention, and he turned to see his phone vibrating on the old bench he kept. Izuku walked over while taking off his gloves. He grabbed it and looked at the ID to see it was Inko. Yeah, Mom? Hello, dear. I called because have a package here with your name on it. Inko said as Izuku tensed. For me? Yes, it was sent by this rather nice person who had been sending us things ever since you left. And apparently they know you've come home. Izuku was quiet for a moment. Does it have a sender name? Ooh, yes, actually, hold on. Noises come from the phone as he assumes Inko is grabbing it. It says Dumb Bunny. Izuku's eyes light up at the name. It's a mixture of happiness with a slight pinch of dread. I always wondered why they chose that and didn't just leave a better name. I'll be there later today. Okay, Izuku, I'll tell the triplets, and they can tell you about the upcoming sports festival. All right, see you later, Mom. See you soon, dear. Izuku hung up and placed the phone in his pocket. He moved towards the nail protruding from a wall he used to hang his overcoat on and grabbed it on his way out. Izuku moved the tarp he hung on the entrance aside and walked into the afternoon sun. He looked over at the Plymouth, which was parked next to the rig, currently detached from its trailer. Izuku strode over to the Plymouth and hopped in. He didn't start the car immediately, instead reaching for the glove box and take out an old photo. Izuku looked at the photo, his face wistful as he thought of the past. Welp, time to face the past again. Izuku placed the photo showing him in his old Yua coveralls and a bronze-skinned girl with crimson eyes and rabbit ears in the normal Yua Hero Course uniform posing with Yua gates behind them. Izuku walks into the lobby of the apartments. The receptionist looks up and smiles at him. Hello, Midoriya, how's it going? Izuku nods towards her. It's good. Niai, how's your brother? He walks toward the desk and stops in front of it. Oh, he's better, thank Kami. Apparently, he'll be able to come home in a few days. That's good. Anyway, I gotta get up to my family, so talk to you later, Niai. Maki Niai nods with a small smile and Izuku turns toward the elevator and enters. Izuku listens to the music as he waits for it to stop on the floor. The elevator opens and he strides out. Izuku knocks on the apartment door and is met by Hisashi, who smiles as he sees Izuku. Ah, hello, Izuku. Hey, Dad, Izuku responds. Hisashi moves aside and lets Izuku in. He barely makes it 4 steps, and he notices the lack of 3 certain sisters. Where are the triplets? Oh, the US Sports Festival is in a few days. They're out training for it. Hisashi responds before turning towards the hall. Inko, Izuku's here. A thud and some footfalls signaled Inko's entrance to the living room. Oh, hello dear. She walked up to Izuku and handed him an envelope. The mail that came for you. Izuku took it and looked at Inko. Thanks, Mom. So, you doing anything later? Inko asked. No, not really. Inko clapped her hands together. Well, Hisashi and I decided that since the triplets have been working so hard for the upcoming sports festival, we'd treat them to a movie night at the show. You mean the movies? Yes, onto my point. Would you like to come with us? Izuku thought for a moment. He hadn't really done much with his family when he came back besides watching TV with the triplets and occasionally listening to Hisashi complain about the woes of office work. Izuku would admit to having written several pages of notes about those rants that he'll forever use to scare himself into never getting an office job. Why not? I think I'll enjoy it. Inko beamed and hugged Izuku, who reciprocated. Inko broke the hug and walked over to the house phone to call the triplets. Izuku stood in place, smiling, but glanced at the enclosed letter in his hand. He'd have to read that later. Izuku placed it in a concealed pocket in his overcoat and walked over to his parents. Izuku entered the church and collapsed onto one of the old benches he'd been using as a bed. The movie was all right. It was somewhat surprising to know the rest of his family had become rather fond of old pre-quirk-related movies. Several thoughts went through Izuku's head about random things before landing on a rather important one he had in the back of his head throughout the whole time at the movies. He reached into his coat and grabbed the envelope. He reads the very familiar nickname and just repeats it in his head before tearing the envelope open and taking out its content. He holds the card in his hand and sees it's a VIP pass to the US Sports Festival with a specific room number on the corner. Only one thing came to Izuku. I need to go to the sports festival and hope she doesn't knock my head off my shoulders. Izuku walked through the hall with a sense of foreboding. Izuku hadn't seen her in years. He never said he was leaving, and honestly, that was something he regretted. She was a very fiery person who would rather punch someone than watch someone get punched. The kind of gal you could guarantee would fight over the last piece of pizza in the box. True story. Honestly, Izuku would be lucky not to get kicked by her. Izuku stopped walking and looked at the door to the private VIP booth. He breathed in and out before knocking on the door with a rhythm. Not even a second passed when the door opened and Izuku was grabbed by his collar and dragged into the room, being thrown roughly to the ground. Izuku barely got a look at the assailant when a weight dropped on him and a punch was thrown into his jaw. That was for disappearing for 6 years. A female voice growled. Izuku looked up and bright crimson met dim emerald. Yep, I deserved that, Izuku agreed. And? She growled. I'm an idiot. And? I should have said something before I left. And? Your long lashes are nice. She nodded. They are, yes. Her eyes locked onto his again. And what else? I preferred your original hero outfit, Izuku said, making her frown lessen in confusion. Why? Because you show so much ass. You make plumbers jealous. Hey, I have this outfit for mobility and fanservice. Fanservice? You mean so hentai artists don't need to imagine much? Her eyebrow twitched. 6 years, and you're still able to get under my skin with minimal effort. You make it easy, Rumi. Plus, I doubt the leotard really makes that difficult. Rumi Yuzajama Ake, the rabbit hero. Mirko. Izuku met Rumi back in middle school after breaking her nose in a fight caused by some kid's quirk. Rumi had tracked Izuku down and began talking to him. She respected Izuku for getting a few good hits in, as, apparently, Izuku was the first in the school to actually get a really good hit off. They became friends and stuck by each other all the way to UA. Rumi was in the hero course, while Izuku was in general studies with engineering. They still got together and went to arcades, parks, restaurants, and even underground fight rings. Rumi stared at Izuku. Fuck you, Izuku. I mean, we could, but I'm not into doing that in public, Izuku replied, earning a snort from Rumi. Or do you actually want to, considering where you're sitting? Rumi blinks to then realize she had been straddling Izuku's pelvis the entire time. She stands up and reaches a hand out to Izuku, who takes it and lets himself get dragged up. Rumi backed up a little and puts her hands on her hips. She looks at Izuku's attire and says, "So, well, you certainly let yourself go." Izuku was wearing the same overcoat, slight tears and all, a light gray collared shirt, and worn jeans. Izuku looks down at himself and then back up. I was going for the hobo look, but letting myself go works. Really? Rumi raised a brow. You were going for that look? Yeah, keeps all the women who kept flocking this magnificent mug away. Yeah, but you look like you haven't showered or slept in a week. I'll have you know I got a good 5-hour nap a day ago, and I took a shower before I came here. Oh, is that so? Yeah, so you got a problem with my clothing choice as well as my face now. Yeah, I do have issues with it. I preferred the young teenage rogue look you had. Well, I'm not 19 anymore and neither are you. And I preferred your Yua hero suit, at least that one had pants. I don't need pants. My legs can take the worst impacts now, so I don't need those things. Besides, it's easier to move without them. Yeah, but what about the cold? Rumi opened her mouth to retort, but stopped as she realized where this was going. Rumi, you know damn well the colder months are hell for you. That leotard does not warm you up whatsoever. And even if it did, the fact you don't have pants means you leave your hips susceptible to the cold. You need to stay warmer than usual, as your quirk does more than give you thighs that can in fact save lives. I have a winter outfit, Rumi mumbled like a scolded child. You mean that aviator jacket? The thing that only covers your arms and leaves your legs uncovered besides that? The name escapes me, so I'll just call it a thigh-high boots, Rumi interrupted. They're boots that reach my thigh. Izuku looks at her incredulously, as if the very thing they're called didn't do anything but make him more confused. Thigh-high boots, he repeated. Rumi nodded. Those things, he points at the purple thigh-high boots, are socks with armor on the feet, not boots. Don't even get me started on. As Izuku continued ranting about Rumi's choice of hero outfit, he didn't notice she was walking closer to him. Izuku didn't even notice the distance between the two had closed enough to where Rumi wrapped her arms around Izuku and pulled him into a hug. Izuku stopped his rant as Rumi spoke. I missed you, you big idiot. She then whacked him on the back of the head. But I didn't miss the dissing of my things, jackass. Izuku rubbed the back of his head. It's not a diss. It is a critical review of your horrible fashion choices. Before Rumi could retort, a loud voice blared through the walls. Hello, world. Both Rumi and Izuku immediately moved to a small sofa in the viewing room, Rumi hoping over it, while Izuku sat down normally. And welcome to the annual US Sports Festival, the crowd cheered. I'm your gracious and fantastic host, Present Mike. And with me as my co-host, the sleepyhead himself, Shota Aizawa. Stop being so loud. The voice that was probably Aizawa groused, before Mike went off again, ignoring the grouch. And to our viewers at home, we thank you for tuning in. Now let us get this party started. The crowd once again cheered for the event to begin. Rumi massaged her ears somewhat from the noise. As Present Mike began announcing the classes that would be participating, Izuku was on the lookout for his sisters, and once the first batch of students came out, he took note of 2 heads of green. Izuku grinned as he opened a suitcase he definitely had with him the entire time, even if Rumi had no clue where the hell it came from. He opened it and mumbled, "My time has come." From the suitcase came custom shirts he'd made with the help of Inko and some logistical support from Hisashi. Of course, The logistics were on the best ways to embarrass his siblings. But hey, that's what family does. Izuku took his coat off and tossed it over the back of the sofa as he grabbed a shirt with a picture of a young Izuka, and Izuki in homemade hero costumes, and the caption "The Green Team." Izuku grinned as he checked it over. The pictures he used were from 10 years ago when Halloween came around. The triplets had wanted to have custom costumes to wow their classmates, so Inko, Hisashi, and Izuku had all come together to do exactly that. Izuku had asked the triplets to draw what they wanted, and he had gotten 3 pictures of the triplets in a green outfit. All done in crayon, of course. The costumes were, of course, absolutely adorable, and could in fact be lorded over the heads of each triplet. So Izuku decided to break out some old pictures and place them on a few shirts. Izuku looked back down at the students participating and finally saw the third head of green he was looking for. Rumi was looking over at him with a raised eyebrow, and when Izuku noticed, he explained, "I'm rooting for my sisters and showing my support by embarrassing the hell out of them." Rumi snorted while looking at the suitcase sitting on the couch. "Can I get in on this?" she asked. "Sure," Izuku answered. "I expected you'd ask, so I packed a custom hat just for you." He ended with a mischievous glint in his eyes. Rumi looked over at the suitcase to notice the white bill of a baseball cap sticking out. Assuming that was the one he meant, she grabbed it and held it up to examine it, and finally saw what he meant. She looked at Izuku with an eyebrow raised in amusement, as he responded with a smirk. Rumi donned the hat with her nickname. "So, how's it feel to know everyone can tell you're a dumb bunny?" Izuku asked. "Feels great, Broccoli Man," Rumi responded dryly. "I'm sure it does." Izuku raised an eyebrow at the name. "And Broccoli Man? Really?" Rumi shrugged. It was the first thing that came to mind. Izumi was pumped. She was ready to make a splash and kick the asses of everyone in this competition. Her sisters were no exception. Not even her boito friend, yes, boyfriend, was safe. She bounced on the balls of her feet in excitement as the announcements kept on going. She of course ignored it as she was strategizing on how to kick the tails of each of her classmates and the other class that Izuki was in. She wasn't too worried about her sisters, as she knew she could beat them if Izuki didn't pull that push bullshit. She didn't even register midnight being revealed as the referee or whatever. She didn't care. Izumi went over the classmate she knew would give her trouble and ignored the classmates she could easily kick in the crotch and win. Didn't matter what gender you were. Ida was a threat simply because of his speed. Izumi wasn't so prideful to discard the fact she was definitely slower in comparison, even if she manipulated the fire she made from her throat to send her flying. It was probably best to keep dodging and zigzag around whatever field they would eventually fight in. Ida wasn't too good at sharp turns. Todoroki was going to be a bitch to handle with his precise and not so precise use of ice. Izumi was confident in her fire, but she knew it was practically a small spark compared to Endeavor's, so she knew she couldn't just melt through the ice quick enough, so it'd probably be best to boost herself above the ice. As Izumi continued her analysis of who would give her the most trouble, her eyes reached a VIP booth that was walled off and behind a glass window. She blushed in a mixture of embarrassment and terror. Izuku was standing in the VIP box, and he was wearing a shirt with her old Halloween costume. Oh God, was that the rabbit hero? Murko next to him. Izumi let her head fall into her hands as she groaned. "Oh Kami no tilde. Are you okay, Izumi?" Apparently, her suffering was heard by Izuka as she asked her if she was okay. Izumi didn't answer and just pointed toward the VIP box. Izumi assumed Izuka followed her pointing, because now she was not saying anything, nor does she seem to be breathing. Izumi whacks Izuka's arm and snaps her out of the trance. Izuka's face brightens to a spotlight crimson as she just stutters random curses and other things under her breath. What's going on? And of course, Izuki is now popping into the conversation. Izumi and Izuka just pointed up at the VIP box, holding the culprit of their embarrassment. Izuki looks up to see the exact same thing the others. But instead of ceasing to breathe, she simply sniffles. More sniffles come from her as both Izumi and Izuka look at her to see the most radiant smile in response to Izuku's stunt. "Why are you smiling?" Izumi shouts, her cheeks still dusted red. "Because he's rooting for us, even after *hic*, after everything. Izuki's full-on crying happy tears now. Izumi and Izuka stare at Izuki with incredulous faces, but slowly morph into a more understanding look. It was true when they thought about it. They honestly hadn't expected Izuku to be so supportive of them after what had happened, but there he was, rooting for them in his own way, even if it was embarrassing. Izumi and Izuka looked back at the VIP box and smiled. They were going to interrogate Izuku on how he'd gotten the N for hero to wear that damn shirt though. Izuku watched as the sports festival finally started with the first course. A kilometer obstacle race around the UA Stadium with the finish line as the entrance back into the stadium. He and Rumi watched as all the UA first years got to the tunnel where they'd begin. Izuku was excited to watch his sisters do their best in the festival. When midnight told the racers to go, chaos ensued as people got stuck in the tunnel, with all of them trying to get out first. A moment later, ice consumed the tunnel, and a kid with red and white hair ran through with the ice, following his steps. A moment after that, several other kids using their quirks got through and followed after him. Izuka was carving through the ice path with fire billowing out of her mouth, and was followed by the other two of the trio. Some blonde was screeching at Izuki with indignation. As he skated alongside them, Izuki looked at him with a guilty expression, while Izuka and Izumi looked annoyed. A rumble shook the trio as they looked up to see the 0-pointers from the entrance exam. Izuku recognized them from the triplets telling him about them when they spoke of the exam, and he had to admit he wasn't sure if the students should have had to deal with these things as a test. The 0-pointers were made to look like chumps, though when the kid with red and white hair used his ice to completely freeze one of them and just passed under it, as if it were a morning run. The triplets followed after Candycane and barely got past the frozen 0-pointer before it fell over, blocking most of the other contestants. One kid who seemed to use explosions to propel themselves forward flew over the fallen 0-pointer and landed into a run next to the triplets, as well as shouting something at the three before making himself propel forward with his explosions. Izumi seemed to be ticked at whatever the boy had said and broke from the group and manipulated the fire streaming from her mouth to her hands and propelled herself forward similar to the explosion kid. The other two sisters seemed more annoyed with Izumi than the other kid. Eventually, the participants reached the second obstacle, which was a large pit trap with ropes you climb across to several pillars to get across. The triplets managed well enough, though Izuki nearly fell multiple times and had to use her quirk on herself to keep upright and to save herself from one nasty fall. The top three runners were displayed on the Jumbotron and shown to be Candycane, now known to be named Shoto Todoroki, was in first. The kid with explosions, Katsuki Bakugo, that name sounded familiar to Izuku, was in second, and very close behind Todoroki. Third place was Izumi, and she was rushing like a madwoman after Bakugo. Izuka and Izuki were in 12th and 13th respectively, and still going through the race together and overall just making sure they both get through it all. The frontrunners finally made it to the last obstacle, which was a non-lethal minefield made with heavy sound waves to send someone flying. Todoroki continued freezing his way through, covering the mines and causing them to not explode. Bakugo just flew over them, still using his quirk to catch up to Todoroki, and Izumi just watched her step, while bolting after Bakugo still. One kid thought he could make it through by just running faster than the mines. He didn't last long. Eventually, all three front runners passed the minefield and made it into the final stretch and close to the tunnel leading to victory. The three entered, and everyone in the crowd went quiet, waiting for whoever won to enter the stadium. "Hell yeah!" Izuku yelled, immediately followed by a roaring crowd as Izumi, Midoriya, and Katsuki Bakugo ran out of the tunnel with the former's head held high. Izuku's smile could have rivaled All Might on a great day, and Rumi could have competed for best grin of the year. Todoroki came in right behind the two victories with a neutral face, but walked off after staring at the duo, now yelling at each other in front of millions of spectators. The other contestants eventually made it to the stadium, including Izuka and Izuki at a comfortable 7th and 8th place, though only the contestants above 43 could continue, while everyone else was sent to their classes' designated areas to watch the rest of the sports festival. A few minutes were given so the competitors could rest before the next event, but once Midnight retook the stage, she announced they'd be doing a cavalry battle. Izuku had never been a fan of cavalry battles. His team would always fall in his middle school festivals. Rumi was always better as the front horse in those situations if he wanted any chance of winning. The cavalry battle went for about 15 minutes and ended with Bakugu's team, which consisted of the triplets, at the stop spot even after Team Todoroki had taken their 10 million point headband after 3 minutes, but T-10 seconds before the bell signaling the end. They pulled a 100-ick play and used a mix of Izuka's quirk and Izumi to distract the rider of Team Todoroki, while Izuki used her quirk to pull the headband straight to her. The event ended with Team Bakugu in first, Team Todoroki in second, Team Kirishima in third, and two other teams Izuku literally cared less for. "Breaks on, see you in a bit," Izuku said, hopping over the couch and heading to the door. Midnight had just called for a 43-minute break until the 1v1 fight started, and Izuku wanted to get a few words in with his sisters. Yeah, Rumi waved while using the new space on the couch to stretch her body. Izuku placed his coat back on as he walked out of the VIP room and into the hall. Izuku readjusted his sleeves as he made his way down a stairwell toward what he believed to be the contestant rooms. He stepped off the stairwell into a slightly isolated hall and turned to see a sight so shocking he froze. Izumi was making out with that kid, Bakugo Katsuki. Izuku's brow twitched as brotherly instincts demanded he tear the ashen blonde's lips off his sister's, and then shove a lump of burning coal into his mouth while wrapped up in the rider's chains. Izuku didn't even realize his eyes flashed orange for a moment before marching up to the two. They were rather engrossed in what was happening, so Izuku positioned himself behind Bakugo and leaned on the wall in the position of Izumi's sight as soon as she opened her eyes, which she did a few moments after he positioned himself. Izumi tensed visibly as she saw the grin her brother was sporting and the predatory glare he was sending toward Bakugo. "Izuku," she screeched while detaching herself from the blonde. "Izumi, what's wrong?" Bakugo never finished his sentence as a hand grabbed his shoulder, and the hallway felt cold all of a sudden. Bakugo slowly turned his head toward the hand that was clasped onto his shoulder, which seemed to be getting warmer. Bakugo turned his head up and finally saw the face of Izuku staring at him with a grin he'd recognized as one Bakugo himself had sported in a fight. Only this grin was directed at him and far more vicious than his own would ever have any right to be. The atmosphere was suffocating, the air was cold, and it was just Katsuki and Izuku. Izuku's hand got warmer and warmer. Wham! Irk! Izuku doubled over after Izumi rammed her elbow into his gut. He laughed it off, however, and backed up as Izumi pointed at him threateningly. "Was that really necessary?" "Izuku, you didn't have to scare Kekken like that," Izumi yelled, still pointing at Izuku. "Well, what'd you expect me to do? I come down those stairs," he points his thumb back toward the stairwell, "and see you and this kid shoving tongues, and you expect me not to pull rank. You haven't ever pulled rank." "Yeah, I have." "When?" 6 years old. Comic store. Candy pellets," was all Izuku said, and Izumi's face burst into metaphorical flames. "You said you'd never speak of that." "I'm not. Simply reminding you of a time I pulled rank as the older brother." As the two siblings squabbled, Bakugo just watched with a face basically declaring WTF. He eventually shook his head and said, "Izumi, who the hell is this?" Izumi and Izuku stopped, remembering that Bakugo was still standing there, and turned to the confused teenager with perfect synchronicity. He's my older brother. Izuku, introduce yourself to my boyfriend, Izumi said. Izuku looked at Bakugo, sizing him up before bringing up his hand. Izuku Midoriya, Izumi's older brother. Bakugo grabbed the offered hand and shook it. Katsuki Bakugo, Izumi's boyfriend and future #1 hero. The claim to being the future N1 didn't really do anything for Izuku besides giving him the belief of Bakugo being somewhat boastful. Alright, nice to meet you, Bakugo. Izuku turned away from Bakugo to Izumi. Anyway, just wanted to get a chance to speak to you before the 1v1s. I've still gotta talk to Izuki and Izuka, so if I want to catch them I gotta go. Alright, love you Izuku, Izumi said. You too. Izuku walked past them and continued on his way to find Izuka and Izuki. Geez, Bakugo finally said. I get the whole older brother shtick, but using your quirk to intimidate someone. Really? Izumi just looked at Bakugo like he was stupid. My brother's quirkless, idiot. What? I coulda sworn. Then you imagined it. My brother never got a quirk. Izumi's mood noticeably dampened as she said that. It caused a lot of issues for him, but he still keeps going, or he wouldn't be here. She mumbled out that last part too quietly for Bakugo to hear. Bakugo stared at the retreating form of Izuku, quirkless. Then could I have imagined that? Izuku walked around the halls looking down farther halls and asking random students he came across about Izuka and Izuki. Two of them, a kid with a crow's head and an unhealthy amount of emo vibes, and a kid with a blue gator and multiple arms, told Izuku he'd probably find Izuka and Izuki up at the a locker rest area. Izuku thanked them and made his way up another floor and around a few halls. After another corner, he saw Izuki at the end of the hall talking with someone. He was tall, skinny, so much so Izuku was kinda worried about the guy's health, and had blonde hair. Izuku got closer, and he was able to hear a snippet or two of what they were saying. Something about one for all and all might. Izuku was now right up behind them and smirked. So, what are we talking about? Izuki and the guy stood ramrod straight, and the guy seemed to be leaking blood from his mouth. Both of them turned toward him, and Izuki immediately realized what had just happened. Izuku, don't scare me like that. Sorry, couldn't help it. You were just so susceptible to it. Izuku answered easily. But besides that, how are you feeling? For what? In general, or for the 1v1s? Why not both? Well, I'm confident I'll be able to defeat a few of my opponents by pushing them out of the ring. It'd just depend on the size of it, and if they have a quirk that allows them to take to the air. What if for the ones that can take to the air you bring them toward you and try to get them on the ground before pushing them out? That could work. But I'm not exactly confident in my hand-to-hand when they get close. A cough from next to them made them realize both had gone off track and forgotten about the tall blonde man. The tall blonde looked between them with unveiled confusion. Young Midoriya, he began, looking at Izuki. Who is this man? Oh, sorry, all Miyagi-sensei, she corrected with a panicked look. This is my older brother, Izuku Midoriya, who should be up in the stands waiting for the 1v1s to start. She finished with a pointed look toward Izuku. What? Can your older brother not check up on his sisters before they have to beat the tar out of each other in the 1v1s? Izuki attempted to answer, but kept stuttering. Do not worry, young Midoriya, Yagi said to Izuki before turning to Izuku. I believe you are allowed to be down here, but I'm unsure if any heroes roaming the halls will know that. Izuku waved Yagi off. If a hero has a problem with me speaking with my sisters, I'll just give them a piece of my mind or secretly record them giving me shit and post it online, ruining the career of the hero and slowly driving them into a sense of inferiority until they believe the whole world is against them and hang up their cape forever, and from then on being known as the hero who wouldn't let an older brother see his sisters. Izuki and Yagi just stared at Izuku after his rant in silence, while Izuku smiled back. Anyway, what exactly do you teach my sister? Yagi coughed to dispel the mental image Izuku gave him with his small rant. I'm just her trainer, trying to get her to be the best hero she can be. Really? Yeah. Well, you've done a rather swell job. From what I can tell, Izuki's quirk is a lot stronger than I remember it being. Wasn't that the truth? Izuku remembered Izuki's quirk being capable of pulling up to 50 pounds before he left. Now, if Izuku was correct in what he's seen, Izuki could pull and push things weighing up to a few hundred pounds. Yeah, I'm proud of how far young Midoriya has come, Yagi said with an obvious sense of pride in his voice. Izuki visibly beamed at the praise, and Izuku couldn't help the small smile that crept up on his own lips. Good. Anyway, I best get going. I still have to find Izuka, Izuku said. Oh, I think she'll be in the one awaiting rooms about a floor up, Izuki said. Izuku smiled and ruffled her hair. Thanks, Izuki. Good luck in your matches, and remember to kick their asses. With that, Izuku began his trek to find Izuka. As Izuku climbed up a stairwell, he checked his watch to see how much time he had left for the break, and nearly tripped when he saw he only had 10 minutes left. Increasing his speed, he walked up the stairs, going 2 steps at a time. Izuku eventually came to the floor. He wanted, lightly panting from the speed he came up at, and immediately set off for down the hall, passing a few random students as he went. Izuku rounded a corner and began hearing muffled voices from a waiting room with a plaque on the door. He stopped in front of the door for a moment and listened to the muffled voices. Yep, one of those voices was Izuka. Smiling to himself, he knocked on the door in a rhythmic tune. A few sounds of shuffling came from the door before it was opened by a tall guy with blue hair and glasses. Yes? Blue hair asked. Is Izuka Midoriya in there by any chance? Izuku asked. Yes. Why do you require her, sir? Name's Izuku Midoriya, and I just want to talk to my sister is all. The kid's face lit up and nodded. Midoriya. The kid turned around toward the room. It's your brother. The sound of a chair scraping across the floor signaled Izuka to stand up, and the kid opened the door so Izuku could see Izuka marching forward with determination. Izuku immediately began backing slightly. Now no need to do anything, bras. Before Izuku could finish, Izuka dashed forward and placed her fist directly into his gut. Izuku stumbled back into the wall, groaning. Come on. What is with you and Izumi with the gut punches? Maybe you should be less enthusiastic about your choice in cheering on your sisters, Izuka replied. Awa. But that's the best way. How am I supposed to cheer on someone if I don't have their merch? That's not official merchandise. So you're saying you will get some when you go pro. It'll be for the masses and not you. Izuku placed a hand over his heart and recoiled as if hit. Oh, you wound me. I'm not considered a part of the masses in your eyes. Of course not. You are my older brother, and that makes you superior and be held to different standards. Oh, so the Midoriya family is a bunch of nobles, huh? If I make it as a popular hero, then yes, that is how we'd be treated. I have no doubts Izumi will become a top hero and Izuki will become a paragon for the people, so you should be prepared for that either way. Hearing the way she spoke so confidently about what their sisters would become, but making it seem she wouldn't, made Izuku frown. That's not always the case. Your quirk isn't lacking in power, if that's why you think you won't make it. Izuka simply shook her head. That's not what I mean. Izumi and Izuki have far more open personalities than me. Izumi is loud and boisterous, even if she needs to watch that mouth of hers, and Izuki is practically a shining ball of optimism. I'm neither of those things. My personality is nowhere near those two. Statistically, my mannerisms are not anywhere near the personality to be one of those. People love heroes that grin and shout out things. I'm not one of those. I'm fine with how it'll go, however, as I don't plan on being the best. I just want to help people. Izuku was quiet for a moment, digesting what he heard. A few moments after, he smiled. I think you put far too much thought into statistics. Heroes have shattered those expectations placed on them before, and while I have no idea what you're being taught, I think you still have a few years to learn what kind of hero you'll be. Izuka's lip twitched at Izuku's words, as close to a smile you'd usually get from her aside from a few incidents. She nodded, but before any more words could be said, an announcement came over the intercom. "Breaks over, people," Present Mike announced. "US students who've gotten to the finals, come on down for a total beatdown." Izuku looked up, and then back to Izuka. "Well, good luck, Izuka." With that, and a small head pat, Izuku walked back off to the VIP booth, and momentarily realized those two students with Izuka never introduced themselves. It's not like he needed to know their names. Izuku came back to Rumi stuffing 3 carrots into her mouth. She had threatened if a rumor got out about her, and what she was doing, Izuku would be kicked to the moon. Izuku had simply responded by saying he'd be the first human on the moon to have been kicked there. They settled on the couch and watched as the remaining contestants duke it out. The first battle was between Izuki and some kid who looked like he needed sleep. Poor guy got blasted out by Izuki, using her quirk to push him out of bounds. The second fight wasn't much of a fight, and more of a curb stomp. The ice kid made a glacier to encase the kid with cellophane tape dispenser arms. Honestly, Izuku was curious as to why the ice kid felt the need to do that. The third fight was more interesting, as it was Izuka and some girl who had her hands together in what seemed like a prayer. The girl also had vines for hair, so it wasn't a very fair matchup, as Izuka burned the vines and sucker punched the vine girl with enough force to knock her out. Well, at least he knew Izuka hit other people just as hard as she hit him. The next fight made Izuku rather nostalgic. A fight between the blue-haired kid, Tenya Ida, and Mei Hatsume. Ren must be so proud of her. Izuku had met Mei once when she was young, and even then she had an eye for machinery. Of course, Mei had turned the whole fight into an ad about her inventions. Oh, Ren had to be so proud of her. The next fight wasn't that interesting. If anything, it was rather embarrassing. Poor guy got his pants burned by acid and his underwear exposed to the world before receiving an uppercut. It was around the next fight that Izuku suddenly remembered something. "Oh shit," Izuku exclaimed. Rumi jumped a little with the suddenness of the exclamation as she was focused on the fights. "What?" Rumi said back, wondering what made Izuku yell out in worry. "Arumi?" Izuku hesitantly looked at her. "How, did those spring and summer months go?" Silence. Complete silence beside the rumbling of the crowd roaring at what seemed to be the end of the current bot. Rumi stared at Izuku with a blank face as Izuku began sweating a bit. "And you bring this up why?" Rumi said, her face deadpan and her voice monotone. "Well, it just popped in there, just a random thought. And it made me realize I don't know how those times went, so I'm just wondering if you got a replacement." "Replacement? Is that really what you just called them?" "I don't have any other way of saying it." "What? You want me to say, 'Hey Rumi, did you find another sex buddy? Since I left you don't just say that.'" Rumi sighed. "Well, I'm happy to inform you that you have been replaced." "Great. So he treats you well?" "She treats me just fine." "She? Huh? Batting for the other team, are you, Rumi?" "It was a mutual agreement. I met her at a party I was asked to be at, and those urges kicked in while there. Thankfully she recognized them, and we got to talking. She had a similar problem, but apparently had better control of it since her quirk doesn't really involve an actual animal. But she still has a heat cycle, funnily enough. Anyway, she offered, so we went to an apartment and ravaged each other until the morning, and have been meeting for the last 6 years." "Huh, well that's good. Admittedly, I thought you might have just held those urges with an iron grip." "No, that's a bad idea. My doctor has told me before that doing that makes the person a ticking time bomb. It's not a good idea. People with a quirk that causes a heat cycle cannot be ignored, it just makes it worse. And you can be prone to jumping the first person that makes a saucy joke." Yeah, I can only imagine the carnage. Izuku shivered at the image of Mirko running down some random guy or girl for her carnal desires. Yeah, I'm good, Rumi waved off. Besides that, I've been all over the country, and I don't plan on sticking to Musutafu that long. How long? About a month at most. I've already been here for a few weeks though. Really? Yeah, haven't looked at the news of me kicking villain butt. Admittedly, I haven't really sat down to watch the news in a while. Izuku had more pressing matters, specifically trying to mend family ties, which has gone well so far. You haven't? Then, do you know about the Ghost Rider? Yeah, I know about it. Rumi turned back toward the fights currently going on, her eyes narrowing before she spoke. I still can't believe he wasn't caught in that whole mess. A week. A fucking week of that damn villain on a rampage, and nobody could stop him. No one could even keep pace. That fucking monster killed more people than any villain in Japan in the last 2 decades. Basically slaughtered all of the northern villain gangs that stayed out of sight. Rumi growled out that last bit while Izuku listened to her. Honestly, I wish I'd been here when this shit happened. I'd have kicked that damn skull right off. Moreover, I wish All Might was there. He'd have made that villain look like small fry. But since he's tied himself down to Musutafu, because of Yua he's stuck here. Rumi sighed as she caught herself before she continued ranting. Sound like you really hate the Ghost Rider. That probably wasn't the right thing to say as Rumi began speaking again. Oh Tilda, I do. He's the murderer of nearly 300 people in Japan alone. If it were just villains, I'd probably not care as much. But he went after normal people as well. People with no prior crimes or even a fucking parking ticket. Those people didn't have that coming. Rumi finally couldn't help herself and began ranting. Izuku listened as the rant stretched to even include statistics on how society seemed to be reacting to the incident people have begun to call the Ghost Incident. Not a very creative name, but it's gained traction in media and online discussions. Izuku listened to all this, but his own thoughts still broke through. Izuku seriously doubted the writer went after any innocents. That wasn't its thing. The writer knows what people have done, and if it believes the sin is unforgivable or simply too gruesome, it won't hesitate. While the police may not know what the victims did to give the writer cause for its actions, Izuku had a pretty good idea. It held the obese man in its grasp. Ah, she wanted it. She was practically. I didn't even know him. Please, I didn't. She never finished as she was decapitated by its chain. Please, cash, drugs, women, men, whatever you w. She didn't finish as it lit her ablaze. Flashes of when the rider is in control come to him sometimes. Not a lot, so he never gets the full picture. Just enough to understand. No one that the rider killed was innocent. But he wouldn't blame the heroes and police for thinking that. So, what is the plan for the Ghost Rider? Izuku asked. TCH, I haven't been informed. The general consensus for most heroes is to call for backup. The Ghost Rider is very strong with that mutant quirk, and because of his fiery visage, Endeavor has been barred from attempting to fight with him. Which is fair, 2 fiery combatants going at each other is a recipe for damage and casualties. Izuku didn't ask anything more after that. It was obvious the rider was a topic to be dropped, and just watched the continuing matches with Rumi, who was quiet for the rest of the fights. Well, that was the sports festival, and Izuku would gladly admit he preferred to see it on the TV. It got so many more angles than just watching from above the arena. Izuku watched the reward ceremony and clapped when Izuki got the 2nd place medal from All Might of all people. She must have been so happy to see her idol in person. Izuku watched as the festival began winding down, and when Present Mike came onto the intercom, announcing the end of the sports festival, Izuku stood up. Leaving? Rumi asked from her spot on the couch. Yeah, I'm gonna drive the triplets home, so I gotta meet up with them, Izuku answered as he tucked a shirt into the suitcase. Well, hold on a moment. Rumi got up and walked over to a table on the side of the room where she grabbed a notepad and a pencil. A few moments of writing later, and Rumi set down the pencil and walked over to Izuku and stuck the pad to his forehead. Make sure to call, will ya? Izuku grabs the notepad and looks at Rumi. I will. But also remember to call me if you're having issues. Rumi smiles. I will, but don't worry. Any physical issues are now put onto my new sex bud, so it'll just be emotional or very long venting session about how my day went, and how I'm somewhat uncomfortable with how many people take photos of my ass and maximize the picture to get a peek underneath, or how I've been asked some rather embarrassing questions by random fans, and how one has literally asked me if I have a heat cycle. Kami, I was so tempted to kick that guy to the moon. Can I take back my previous statement? Nope. You're stuck with me and my baggage, Rumi enthusiastically stated. Great tilde, well, I better get going, Izuku said, turning towards the door. Ha? Yeah, see you, Zoo, Rumi said. See you later, dumb bunny. With that, Izuku walks out of the room and into the hallway. On his way, he passes a lanky man in a white suit with a red polka dot tie on his way to meet with Mirko.